About 6 months ago, at 34, I finally saved enough to buy my first place. A small ranch-style house on Willow Drive in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio. The house needed work, sure, with its peeling yellow paint and overgrown backyard. But after years of cramped apartments and noisy neighbors, having my own space felt like winning the lottery. I worked remotely as a technical writer for a software company, which meant I spent most days alone in my home office, just me and my laptop and the occasional video call with colleagues scattered across different time zones. The solitude never bothered me. Actually, I preferred it that way, especially after going through a rough divorce the previous year that left me craving peace and quiet more than anything else. The closet thing started about 3 weeks after I moved in, subtle at first, barely worth mentioning. Every morning when I woke up, the bedroom closet door would be cracked open maybe an inch or two, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. Now this closet wasn't anything special, just a standard sliding door with those mirrored panels that made the small bedroom look bigger than it actually was. At first I blamed the house settling, or maybe the door wasn't properly aligned on its track, because old houses do weird things, right? But here's what got under my skin. I specifically remembered closing that door completely every single night before bed, pushing it firmly until I heard that little click that meant it was fully shut, because I had this thing about closed doors and organized spaces, probably from years of living in chaos with my ex who left everything open and scattered. Everywhere. After about a week of this morning routine, wake up, see the gap in the closet door, feel mildly annoyed, I decided to get serious about fixing it. I grabbed my toolbox from the garage, adjusted the rollers on the track, tightened every screw I could find, even sprayed some WD-40 on the mechanism for good measure. That night I made absolutely sure to close it tight, actually stood there for a solid minute watching to see if it would slide back open on its own, but nothing happened. The next morning, same damn gap, maybe even wider this time. Like whatever was causing this wanted me to know my little repair job meant nothing. I started taking photos with my phone each night after closing it and each morning when I found it open, creating this weird little collection of evidence that I wasn't going crazy. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in early November, when I woke up and the door was open about 6 inches, wide enough that I could see into the darkness of the closet from my bed. Something about seeing that black gap in the morning light made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain, like when you're a kid and you're convinced something's hiding in the shadows but you're too scared to check. I actually called my buddy Nathan that afternoon, asked him if he wanted to come over for beers, and casually mentioned the door situation, hoping he'd offer some logical explanation I hadn't thought of. Nathan suggested maybe I was sleepwalking, getting up in the middle of the night to open it without remembering, which seemed reasonable enough except for one thing. I'd never sleepwalked in my entire life, not once. And my ex would definitely have mentioned it during one of our many arguments if I had been wandering around at night doing weird stuff. That's when I decided to buy a camera, one of those small Wi-Fi enabled ones you can hide pretty much anywhere, because I needed to know what was happening in my bedroom while I slept. The guy at Best Buy recommended this tiny thing, barely bigger than a golf ball, that could record in night vision and save everything to the cloud automatically. I mounted it on top of my dresser behind some books, angled perfectly to capture both my bed and the closet door, then spent an embarrassing amount of time testing different positions to make sure it caught everything without being obvious. That first night with the camera running, I actually had trouble falling asleep, kept staring at the closet door like it might suddenly spring open while I watched, but eventually exhaustion won and I drifted off around midnight. My phone set to alert me if the camera detected any movement. The notification woke me at exactly 3:27 in the morning, my phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. I grabbed it with clumsy fingers, still half asleep and confused, squinting at the screen that showed a motion alert from the bedroom camera. My heart started hammering as I opened the app, expecting to see myself sleepwalking just like Nathan had suggested, ready to laugh at my own paranoia, and maybe schedule a doctor's appointment to figure out why I'd suddenly developed this weird nighttime habit. But when the live feed loaded, I was still in bed, clearly visible in the grainy night vision footage, lying on my side facing away from the closet. The door, however, was moving, sliding open inch by inch with deliberate slowness, like someone was being extremely careful not to make any noise. I stayed perfectly still in bed, watching my phone screen while pretending to sleep, every muscle in my body tensed like a coiled spring. Through the camera feed, I watched the door continue its slow journey until it was open about 8 inches, and then I saw it. A hand, pale and thin in the night vision footage, fingers wrapped around the edge of the door from the inside. The hand just stayed there for what felt like forever but was probably only 30 seconds, gripping the doorframe like it was testing, waiting, making sure I was really asleep. Then came the part that made me bite down on my tongue to keep from making any sound. A head emerged from the darkness of the closet, followed by shoulders, and I watched in absolute horror as a person, a grown man wearing what looked like a dark hoodie, slowly crawled out of my closet on his hands and knees, moving with the practiced silence of someone who had done this many times before. The intruder stayed crouched by the closet for several minutes, and through the camera I could see him watching my bed, his head tilted at an angle like he was listening to my breathing. He was skinny, probably in his 40s based on what I could make out, with scraggly hair that hung past his shoulders and clothes that looked like they hadn't been changed in weeks. Then he started moving around my room with disturbing familiarity, opening my dresser drawers just enough to peer inside, picking up items from my nightstand and examining them before placing them back exactly where they belonged. He went through my dirty laundry basket in the corner, actually lifted one of my worn shirts to his face, and I had to suppress the urge to jump up and confront him right then. But fear kept me frozen in place, unsure if he might have a weapon or what he'd do if cornered. After about 20 minutes of this nightmare, the man crawled back toward the closet, his movements just as careful and calculated as before. I watched him slide backwards into that dark space, pulling the door most of the way closed behind him, leaving it open just those familiar few inches that I'd been waking up to every morning. The realization hit me like ice water. This man had been living in my closet, coming out every night while I slept, going through my things, watching me, and who knows what else. My closet was deeper than standard. I remembered from the house tour. Something about it extending under the stairs, with that weird angular space in the back where I'd shoved some old boxes when I moved in. There was enough room back there for someone to hide, especially someone thin and flexible enough to contort themselves into that corner behind my hanging clothes and storage containers. I lay there until sunrise, unable to move, unable to think clearly, just watching that closet door through both my own eyes and the camera feed on my phone. When morning light finally crept through the windows, I carefully got out of bed, grabbed my car keys and wallet from the dresser, and walked straight out of the house in my pajamas and bare feet. I sat in my car in the driveway and called 911, told them everything while watching the front door of my house to make sure he didn't try to leave. The cops arrived within 10 minutes, 3 patrol cars with lights flashing, and I gave them my house keys and told them exactly where to look. They went in with guns drawn, shouting commands, and about 5 minutes later they walked out with the man in handcuffs, his head down, not resisting at all, just shuffling along like he was disappointed his secret had been discovered. The detective who took my statement later told me the guy's name was Leonard Briggs, a 51-year-old with a history of breaking and entering, trespassing and voyeurism charges going back 15 years. He'd been living in my closet for almost 2 weeks, surviving on food he'd steal from my kitchen during his nightly excursions. Apparently he'd been very careful to only take things I wouldn't notice. A handful of crackers here, a bit of lunch meat there, sips from different bottles so the levels wouldn't drop noticeably. They found his makeshift nest in that back corner of the closet, a sleeping bag compressed into a tiny bundle, empty water bottles he'd pee in during the day when I was home, protein bars, and a notebook where he'd been writing down my daily routine. When I showered, when I left for grocery runs, when I had video calls for work. The most disturbing part was a collection of my personal items he'd hoarded back there. A few unwashed coffee mugs I thought I'd misplaced, some underwear from my laundry, Even my old work ID badge from the job I'd quit 6 months ago that I figured got lost in the move. Leonard had apparently done this before in other houses, the detective explained, picking homes with single occupants who worked from home, studying their patterns for weeks before making his move. He'd accessed my house through a basement window I didn't even know could open, had been living in my basement for days before discovering that perfect hiding spot in my bedroom closet where he could watch me more closely. They charged him with burglary, criminal trespass, and stalking, and he's currently serving a 5-year sentence, though I doubt that's enough to stop him from doing it again when he gets out. I moved out of that house the next week, didn't even go back to pack properly, just hired movers to grab everything while I waited outside. Now I live in a studio apartment with no closets at all, just open wardrobes and transparent storage shelves, and I sleep with every light on because I need to see every corner of my space at all times, need to know that I'm truly alone when I close my eyes at night. The house on Birchwood Lane caught my eye during a particularly rough patch in my life. 26 and fresh out of a messy breakup, I needed somewhere quiet to rebuild myself, somewhere that didn't echo with memories of shared meals and whispered promises. The realtor, a chatty woman named Gloria with hair the color of expired honey, mentioned the place had been empty for 8 months. She kept adjusting her oversized glasses while explaining how the previous tenants had broken their lease early, something about a job transfer to Seattle. The rent was surprisingly affordable for a 2-story house with original hardwood floors and a sprawling backyard that backed up to a wooded area. I signed the lease that same afternoon, ignoring the musty smell that seemed to seep from the walls and Gloria's nervous habit of checking her phone every few minutes. Moving in took me 3 days in early September, hauling boxes up those creaky stairs until my legs burned and my back screamed for mercy. The master bedroom had this beautiful bay window that overlooked the backyard, though the view was partially blocked by an enormous oak tree whose branches scraped against the glass whenever the wind picked up. I remember unpacking my kitchen stuff first, carefully arranging my grandmother's vintage plates in the cabinets and hanging my collection of mismatched coffee mugs on the little wooden rack near the stove. That first week felt like playing house, like I was pretending to be a real adult with a real life instead of someone whose entire world had crumbled just 2 months earlier. The neighbors seemed friendly enough. The Johnsons next door had twin boys who rode their bikes up and down the street every evening, and old Mr. Garrett across the way would wave from his porch where he sat smoking his pipe and reading newspapers until sunset. The first sign that something wasn't right came about 2 weeks after I'd settled in. I'd bought a whole rotisserie chicken from the grocery store on my way home from work. I was an administrative assistant at a medical clinic downtown. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. I distinctly remember putting half of it in a Tupperware container for lunch the next day, even wrote Tuesday lunch on a sticky note, and slapped it on top. But when I opened the fridge the next morning, bleary-eyed and desperate for coffee, the container was there but completely empty, just a few grease stains on the bottom. I stood there in my pajamas, holding that empty container like it was some kind of puzzle piece that didn't fit. My first thought was that maybe I'd eaten it and forgotten. Maybe I'd had one of those midnight snacking sessions where you barely remember getting out of bed. But the chicken bones weren't in the trash, and I'd checked everywhere, even the bathroom wastebasket, which made 0 sense, but my brain was grasping at straws. Then came the yogurt incident 3 days later. I'd splurged on this fancy Greek yogurt with honey and almonds, the expensive stuff in the glass jars that made me feel sophisticated. Bought 6 jars on Monday, ate 1 that night while watching reality TV and judging people's life choices. Tuesday morning, only 3 jars left. Not empty this time, just gone, vanished like they'd never existed. The refrigerator light flickered when I stood there counting and recounting, as if it was mocking my confusion. I actually called my sister Katie in Phoenix, talking to her while I paced around my kitchen, opening and closing cabinets like the yogurt might be hiding behind the cereal boxes. She suggested maybe I was stress eating without realizing it, that the breakup was affecting me more than I thought. Her voice had that careful tone people use when they think you might be losing it, all gentle and measured like you're a spooked horse that might bolt. The lights were what really started to mess with my head. I'd wake up at random hours, 2 in the morning, 4:30, sometimes right around 3, and there'd be a glow coming from downstairs. Not every night, but often enough that I started keeping a notebook on my nightstand to track it. October 15th, kitchen light on. October 18th, hallway and living room. October 20th, just the lamp by the couch, the one with the crooked shade I kept meaning to fix. Each time I'd creep down those stairs, armed with a baseball bat I'd found in the garage, my bare feet silent on the cold wood. The house would be empty, of course, just me and my racing heartbeat, and the hum of electricity through old wiring. I'd turn everything off, double-check the locks, deadbolt, chain, even the little latch on the back door that led to the laundry room, then climb back to bed where I'd lie awake listening to the house settle, every creak and groan sounding like footsteps. Started to notice other things too, little details that made my skin prickle with unease. My shampoo bottle seemed to empty faster than it should, going from half full to nearly gone in just a few days, when typically a bottle lasted me 2 months. The laundry detergent too, I'd bought the jumbo size in early October, and by the end of the month it was down to the last few loads. Even weirder, sometimes I'd come home to find the toilet seat up in the downstairs bathroom, which made no sense because I lived alone and I'm meticulous about putting it down, a habit drilled into me by growing up with 3 sisters. Once I found a towel on the bathroom floor that I didn't recognize, this threadbare blue thing with a bleach stain shaped like Florida. I held it up to the light, trying to remember if maybe it came with the house, if Gloria had mentioned anything about leaving linens behind, but my memory came up blank. By the first week of December, I was barely sleeping. I'd installed one of those doorbell cameras even though the expense made me wince, and I obsessively checked the footage every morning. Nothing. Just the occasional cat slinking across the porch and leaves dancing in the wind. But the food kept disappearing. An entire loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter I'd just opened, even a whole package of deli ham that I knew I'd put in the meat drawer. I started taking photos of my fridge and pantry before leaving for work, comparing them when I got home like I was playing some twisted version of Spot the Difference. My coworker Janine noticed the dark circles under my eyes, kept offering me her concealer during lunch breaks. I wanted to tell her everything, but how do you explain that your house might be eating your groceries without sounding completely unhinged? The breaking point came 2 days before Christmas. I'd taken a week off work, planning to deep clean the house and maybe paint the spare bedroom this cheerful yellow color I'd seen in a magazine. But first, I decided to be smart about it. Ordered these motion sensors online, the kind that connect to your phone and alert you whenever they detect movement. Spent an entire afternoon setting them up. 1 in the kitchen, 1 in the hallway, 2 in the living room, even 1 pointing at that back door to the laundry room. The guy at the electronics store had looked at me funny when I bought so many, probably thought I was paranoid about burglars. If only it were that simple. That first night with the sensors, I barely dozed off, phone clutched in my hand like a lifeline. Then, at exactly 3:07 in the morning, my phone exploded with notifications. Motion detected. Kitchen, motion detected. Hallway, motion detected. Laundry room. I called the police right then and there, whispering into the phone while I locked my bedroom door and shoved my dresser against it. The dispatcher, a woman with a smoky voice who sounded like she'd heard it all, told me to stay put and keep the door locked. 2 officers arrived within 15 minutes, though it felt like hours as I sat on my bed, clutching that baseball bat and listening to every sound in the house. Officer Brennan was older, probably close to retirement, with gray stubble and eyes that looked tired even at 3 in the morning. His partner, Officer Diaz, couldn't have been much older than me, kept fidgeting with his radio while they searched the house. I watched from the top of the stairs as they went room by room, flashlights cutting through the darkness, checking closets and behind furniture. They found nothing, nobody, just an empty house with all the windows locked tight. Brennan suggested maybe it was mice or even possums that got in somehow, triggering the sensors, but I saw the look they exchanged, That universal expression of dealing with a hysterical woman who's probably imagining things. The next night, same thing. 3 in the morning, sensors going crazy. This time I had my phone recording video when the police arrived, showing them the timestamp, the pattern of movement from the kitchen through the hallway to the laundry room. Officer Diaz seemed more interested this time, asked if I'd noticed anything missing besides food. When I mentioned the toiletries and the strange towel, he wrote it all down in his little notebook, his pen scratching against the paper in the quiet house. They searched again, more thoroughly this time. Brennan even went into the basement, a creepy, unfinished space I'd avoided since moving in, full of old pipes and concrete walls that seemed to sweat moisture. Still nothing. But Diaz pulled me aside before they left, told me to call immediately if it happened again, gave me his direct number scribbled on the back of his business card. His hand lingered on my shoulder for just a moment, and I could see real concern in his eyes, not the dismissive look I'd gotten used to. The third night changed everything. Christmas Eve, and I was sitting in my living room with every light in the house blazing, drinking my 4th cup of coffee and watching the motion sensor app like it was the season finale of my favorite show. 3:02 in the morning, there it was. Kitchen sensor triggered, but this time I didn't call right away. I waited, watched the pattern. Kitchen to hallway, hallway to laundry room, then nothing for 5 minutes. Then the laundry room sensor went off again, stayed triggered for almost 30 seconds, like something was just standing there. That's when I called Diaz directly. He answered on the second ring, sounded wide awake like he'd been expecting my call, told me he was already on his way, to lock myself in the bedroom again. But I was done hiding. I stayed at the top of the stairs, recording everything on my phone, watching as Diaz and Brennan arrived with 2 other officers this time, their flashlights creating a light show through my windows. They went straight to the laundry room this time, like they'd been thinking about it, planning their approach. I heard Diaz calling out to Brennan, his voice sharp with excitement or maybe fear. Then more voices, urgent but controlled, the sound of furniture being moved. 20 minutes later, Diaz came up to get me, his face pale under the hallway light. They'd found it behind the washer and dryer, a hatch, painted the same faded white as the walls, with hinges so well oiled they didn't make a sound. Behind it was a crawl space that connected to the basement through a passage nobody knew existed, not mentioned in any of the house's documentation. Inside that space, they found a makeshift living area. Sleeping bag, canned goods, empty yogurt jars, my yogurt jars, lined up neatly against the wall. Water bottles, a battery-powered lantern, even a small mirror propped up on a milk crate. Whoever had been living there was gone, must have heard the sirens and escaped through the basement while the officers were coming through the front. The investigation revealed more than I wanted to know. The person had been coming and going through a broken ventilation grate in the basement that led outside, hidden behind overgrown bushes near the back of the house. They'd even fashioned a crude pulley system to move the grate from inside, explaining how they could come and go without leaving obvious traces. Detective Morrison, who took over the case after that night, found evidence suggesting someone had been using that crawl space for years, long before I moved in. There were date markings carved into the wooden beams, the oldest one from 2016, food wrappers stuffed into the walls, some so old they were practically fossilized. The previous tenants who broke their lease early. Morrison tracked them down in Seattle. They'd experienced the same things but convinced themselves they were going crazy, choosing to leave rather than dig deeper. Gloria, the realtor, claimed she knew nothing, but Morrison discovered she'd been giving discounts on the rent for years, cycling through tenants who rarely lasted more than 6 months. I moved out the day after Christmas, stayed with my sister Katie until I found a studio apartment downtown. Small, cramped, but entirely mine, with nowhere for anyone to hide. The police never caught whoever had been living in that crawl space. Morrison called me a few weeks later to say they'd found similar setups in 2 other rental properties in the state. Same careful construction, same pattern of coming out around 3 in the morning when people were in their deepest sleep. They think it might be the same person, someone who'd figured out how to exist in the spaces we don't think to look. I still check my motion sensors every night in my new place, even though there's literally nowhere anyone could hide. Sometimes at 3 in the morning, I wake up for no reason, my body trained to expect those notifications. I make myself get up, check the locks, peer into my tiny closet. Everything's always fine, always empty, always safe. But I keep checking anyway, because now I know that the spaces we think are ours might have room for someone else, someone patient enough to wait until we're asleep to live their parallel life in our homes. February in Colorado gets brutal. But that afternoon when I walked through the Victorian on Riverside Court, sunlight was streaming through those huge bay windows like the universe was trying to tell me something. My realtor, Cheryl, this woman with hot pink nails who wore way too much perfume, kept checking her phone and rushing me through the tour, mentioning 3 other couples were coming to see it that same day. I was 31, had just finalized my divorce papers the week before, and desperately needed somewhere that didn't remind me of my ex-husband's cologne or his stupid baseball trophies. Original hardwood floors creaked under my feet as I explored each room, and that wraparound porch sealed the deal for me. What Cheryl didn't mention, what I had to find out later from the mailman, was that the previous owners had packed up in the middle of the night 3 months earlier, leaving half their furniture behind. The property management company had cleaned everything out, painted over whatever needed painting, but nobody in the neighborhood seemed to want to talk about why the Fosters left so suddenly. Moving day came 2 weeks later, and I threw myself into making that house mine with an energy I hadn't felt in years. The guest bedroom became my office, painted this soft sage green that reminded me of my grandmother's breakfast nook, where I used to do homework as a kid. Baxter, my golden retriever mix who usually acted like the world was ending every time a leaf blew past, actually started to calm down in the new space, stretching out on the kitchen tiles while I worked. Being a medical transcriptionist meant I could work from anywhere with decent internet, and the quiet neighborhood seemed ideal for concentration. My new neighbors waved from their driveways but kept their distance, suburban courtesy that suited me fine after months of friends trying to set me up with their cousins or co-workers. The street had this predictable rhythm that felt comforting. School bus at 7:30 sharp, mail delivery around 2, porch lights clicking on at dusk. For the first time since my marriage imploded, I could breathe without feeling like my chest might cave in. Everything changed on a Wednesday night, exactly 3 weeks after I'd moved in. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed 3:07 a.m. when I woke up to Baxter growling, this low rumble I'd never heard from him before. He was standing at the foot of my bed, rigid, staring toward the hallway that led to the back of the house. Then I heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the back door. Not frantic pounding like someone in trouble, not the quick rap of a drunk person at the wrong house. These knocks had a rhythm to them, almost ceremonial. Knock, pause, knock, pause, knock. Each one seemed to echo through the house longer than it should have. Baxter's growl turned into a whine, and he backed up until he was pressed against my legs. I lay there, barely breathing, telling myself it was just tree branches or maybe a raccoon, even though I knew damn well neither of those things knock in perfect intervals. The knocking stopped after maybe 30 seconds, but I couldn't go back to sleep. I spent the rest of the night sitting up in bed with every light in my bedroom on, Baxter curled up beside me, both of us jumping at every creak the old house made. When morning finally came, I checked the back door. Nothing disturbed, no footprints in the flower bed below the porch, no explanation for what we'd heard. I even asked my neighbor, Howard, this retired mechanic who seemed to know everything about everyone on the street, if he'd heard anything strange during the night. He just looked at me for a long moment, then muttered something about possums getting bold this time of year before hurrying back inside. The way he avoided eye contact made my skin prickle. That night, I double-checked all the locks, left the porch lights on, and went to bed hoping it was just a one-time thing, some teenager playing a prank or something equally harmless. 2 nights passed without incident, and I had almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Then Friday hit, and at 3:11 a.m. the knocking returned. This time it started at the back door, same slow, methodical pattern, but after 3 knocks it stopped. The silence stretched out for maybe 10 seconds, and just as I was starting to relax, 3 knocks came from the side of the house, right outside the dining room window. Baxter went absolutely ballistic, barking and snarling like I'd never seen, but he wouldn't leave my bedroom, wouldn't go investigate. I grabbed my phone, fingers fumbling as I tried to dial 911, but then the knocking moved again. 3 knocks at the front door, then silence, then 3 more knocks from the other side of the house near the kitchen. Whatever was out there was circling my house, knocking at different points like it was testing something, mapping the layout, learning the space. The pattern continued for almost 10 minutes. Back door, east side, front door, west side, over and over, before everything went quiet. I did call the police that time, my voice shaky as I tried to explain what happened without sounding completely unhinged. 2 officers showed up about 20 minutes later, did a perfunctory check around the property with their flashlights, and told me they didn't see anything suspicious. The younger one, Officer Valdez, seemed genuinely concerned and said they'd have patrol cars swing by more often. The older cop, though, kept exchanging these looks with his partner, like they knew something I didn't. Before they left, Valdez pulled me aside and asked if I'd considered getting security cameras. Said it real quiet, like he didn't want his partner to hear. The way he said it, urgent but careful, made me realize this wasn't the first time they'd been called to this street for something like this. That weekend, I drove 40 minutes to the nearest electronics store and bought 4 cameras, the best ones I could afford, determined to catch whatever sick person was doing this. Installing those cameras gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt since the knocking started. My brother-in-law, Frank, came over Sunday afternoon to help set them up, 1 covering the back door, 1 on each side of the house, and 1 watching the front porch. The system connected to my phone so I could check the feeds any time, and it would send alerts for any motion between midnight and 6 a.m. Frank, bless him, didn't ask too many questions, just made sure everything was working and showed me how to save footage to the cloud. That first night with the cameras, I actually managed to sleep a few hours, feeling like I finally had some armor against whatever was happening. Monday passed peacefully, then Tuesday, and I started to think maybe whoever it was had seen the cameras and decided to find an easier target. I should have known better. Predators don't just give up when you make things slightly harder for them. They adapt, they wait, they find new ways to get what they want. Wednesday morning, 3:09 a.m., my phone exploded with motion alerts. I grabbed it with trembling fingers, pulled up the live feed, and there he was. A man in a dark hoodie, the hood pulled so far forward I couldn't see any features, just darkness where a face should be. He wasn't at the back door this time. The camera showed him standing in my backyard, maybe 15 feet from the house, perfectly still, facing the back door. He stood there for exactly 3 minutes. I know because I couldn't look away, couldn't even blink. Then he raised his right hand and knocked 3 times in the air, like he was knocking on an invisible door. The motion was slow, deliberate, exactly matching the rhythm I'd been hearing. Then he turned and walked to the east side of the house, disappearing from that camera's view. The side camera picked him up, showed him standing there, making the same knocking motion in the air. He continued this pattern, circling my house, stopping at each point where he'd knocked before, but never actually approaching the doors or windows, never touching anything, just standing at a distance, going through the motions, like he was rehearsing something or performing some kind of ritual. I called 911 while watching him circle my house for the 3rd time, my voice high and panicked, as I tried to explain what was happening. The dispatcher kept asking if he was trying to break in, if he had any weapons visible, and I kept saying no, he's just standing there, knocking on nothing, please just send someone. By the time the police arrived 12 minutes later, the longest 12 minutes of my life, he was gone, vanished between one camera angle and the next, like he knew exactly where the blind spots were. Officer Valdez showed up again, this time with a detective named Reeves, who took everything much more seriously. They reviewed all the footage on my phone, copied the files, took down every detail I could remember. Detective Reeves kept pausing the video, zooming in, trying to get any identifying features, but the hood and the darkness made it impossible. She asked me if I recognized the build, the walk, anything about him, but all I could see was that deliberate, measured way he moved, like someone who had all the time in the world and knew exactly what he was doing. Detective Reeves pulled me aside while Valdez checked the perimeter again and told me straight up that this behavior was escalating. She said the pattern, the testing, the circling, the way he never approached from the same angle twice, suggested someone who was studying my routines, learning when I was most vulnerable. She'd seen similar cases, she said, though she was careful not to give too many details. The way her jaw tightened when she talked about it told me enough. She gave me her direct number, told me to call immediately if anything else happened, and suggested I might want to stay with friends or family for a while. But where was I supposed to go? My parents lived 3 states away. My sister had a new baby and no room, and I'd just spent everything I had on this house. That night, I pushed my dresser in front of the bedroom door, kept all the lights on, and sat up with Baxter, refreshing the camera feeds every few minutes, waiting for him to come back, because somehow I knew he would. People like that don't just stop. They escalate, just like the detective said. 3 nights later, he didn't come to my house. The motion alerts that woke me at 3:15 a.m. weren't from my cameras. They were from the app glitching, showing me static where the feeds should have been. I grabbed my phone to call Detective Reeves, but before I could dial, I heard sirens, lots of them, converging somewhere close. Baxter was pacing, whining, but not at my doors or windows. He kept looking toward the front of the house, toward the street. I crept to my front window, peered through the curtains, and saw police cars, ambulances, the whole circus, 3 houses down at the Andersons' place, the elderly couple who'd always waved when they walked their ancient beagle. My phone rang, Detective Reeves, and her voice was tight, professional, asking if I was okay, if my doors were locked, if I'd seen anything. She couldn't give me details, she said, but they needed my camera footage from the past week, all of it, immediately. The way she said it, I knew the Andersons weren't okay. I knew that whoever had been circling my house, learning my patterns, had moved on to an easier target when I'd made myself too difficult. The guilt hit me like a physical blow. I'd basically pushed him toward my neighbors by installing those cameras, by being vigilant, by not being the easy victim he'd wanted. Detective Reeves called me 2 days later with an update I'll never forget. They'd caught him, not at the Andersons' house, but at another home 6 blocks away, caught in the act of trying to break in through a basement window at 3 a.m. The homeowner, a nurse who worked night shifts, had come home unexpectedly and called 911 when she saw him. His name was Russell Carpenter, 43 years old, lived alone in an apartment complex 2 miles away. When they searched his place, they found notebooks, dozens of them, filled with detailed observations about houses in our neighborhood, sketches of layouts, notes about routines, which houses had dogs, which had security systems when people left for work. My house had 16 pages dedicated to it. The Fosters, the family who'd lived there before me, had 12 pages, ending with a note that said, "Moved away," and the date they'd left. The detective said he'd been doing this for at least 2 years, maybe longer. 7 home invasions they could definitively link to him, all following the same pattern: the knocking, the circling, the studying, then striking when he'd learned enough. The Andersons had survived, barely, hidden in their bathroom while he ransacked their house. Detective Reeves said my cameras probably saved my life, that he'd clearly decided I was too risky after seeing himself on video. Russell Carpenter is serving 25 to life now, but I still wake up sometimes at 3 a.m., and I still check those cameras, because even though I know he's locked up, I can't shake the memory of watching him knock on invisible doors, practicing for the real thing. Two months ago, I finally closed on a house in Portland after my divorce papers went through. My brother kept joking that 34 was the new 21, trying to cheer me up about starting over. But the little ranch-style place on Oakwood Avenue actually did feel like the fresh start I desperately needed. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly families and retired folks who kept their lawns perfect and waved when you drove past. I'd been sleeping on my brother's couch for 6 months while the lawyers sorted everything out, so having my own space again felt incredible. The first week was all about unpacking boxes and trying to remember which one had the coffee maker. I'd taken a month off from my job at the architectural firm to get settled, and honestly just breathe for the first time in what felt like years. The house still smelled like fresh paint from where I'd redone the living room walls, and every morning I'd sit on the back deck with my coffee, watching the fog roll through the pine trees behind the property. The text started on a Monday morning, exactly 9 days after I'd moved in. I was making breakfast, just scrambled eggs and toast, when my phone buzzed on the counter. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, just a local area code I didn't recognize. The message read, "Nice blue flannel. The one with the small rip near the left pocket, you should probably sew that up." I looked down at my shirt, running my finger along the exact tear they'd described, a tiny hole I'd been meaning to fix for months. My first thought was that maybe it was someone from the moving company. They'd seen all my stuff, handled my clothes when they packed the bedroom. But something about the way it was written made my chest feel tight. I texted back asking who it was, but the response came immediately. "You burnt the toast. Better check the smoke alarm batteries while you're at it." The toast was indeed slightly blackened on one edge, still sitting on the plate next to the stove where I'd just pulled it out 10 seconds earlier. I walked to every window in the house, yanking the blinds closed hard enough that the plastic slats clattered against each other. The kitchen window faced the backyard, completely fenced in with a 6-foot privacy fence I'd specifically loved about the place. The living room had those big windows facing the street, but there were thick hedges along the sidewalk that the previous owner had let grow wild and tall. I pressed my face against the glass trying to see through the gaps in the leaves, but couldn't spot anyone out there. Another text came through. "The blinds won't help. You missed the small window in the hallway bathroom, the one with the frosted glass that you never thought anyone could see through." My legs felt weak as I practically ran to the hallway bathroom, and there it was. A narrow window up high that I'd completely forgotten about, the frosted glass doing nothing to hide the basic shapes and movements inside the house. The rational part of my brain kept trying to find explanations while I stood on the toilet lid, struggling with the old paint-sealed window lock. Maybe it was the previous owner playing some sick prank, or neighborhood kids with too much time on their hands. But kids wouldn't know about the shirt, wouldn't know these details. My phone buzzed again. "Your ex-wife had the same panicked look when she found those emails on your laptop." But we both know that wasn't really why she left, don't we? Everything in my body went cold. Nobody knew about the emails except me, Melissa, and our marriage counselor. The emails weren't even the affair she'd suspected, just me talking to a headhunter about job opportunities in California, planning to uproot our entire life without telling her. It was the betrayal of that secret planning that had really ended things, not the suspected infidelity she never found evidence of, because it never existed. I called the police immediately, but the officer who answered sounded like she was reading from a script when she explained they couldn't do much about non-threatening messages. The texts were creepy, sure, but there were no direct threats of violence, no explicit statements about harming me. She suggested I block the number and document everything, maybe file for a restraining order if I could figure out who was sending them. While I was still on the phone with her, another message popped up. "Calling the police won't help. Officer Dana always says that, doesn't she? She's working the dispatch desk today because of her broken ankle. Skiing accident 3 weeks ago." I walked outside with the phone still pressed to my ear, looking up and down the empty street. The officer on the line was indeed named Dana, and when I asked about her ankle, there was this long, uncomfortable pause before she admitted she'd fractured it skiing in Montana recently. That's when the real panic started eating at me. This person knew things that required access to so many different parts of my life. My divorce documents, my daily routines, even real-time information about the police dispatcher. I spent the next 2 hours on the phone with Verizon demanding they trace the number. The customer service rep kept transferring me to different departments, each one more confused than the last about what I was asking for. Finally, I got through to someone in their fraud department who took me seriously. He put me on hold for almost 30 minutes, and when he came back, his voice had changed completely. The number was registered to a prepaid phone, paid for in cash at a convenience store in my neighborhood 6 weeks ago. But here's what made him nervous enough to give me information he probably wasn't supposed to share. The phone's GPS showed it had been within a 3-block radius of my house for the past 9 days, basically since I'd moved in. The Verizon guy, his name was Anthony, started asking me these rapid-fire questions about whether I'd noticed any strange cars, any repair vans that stayed too long, anyone following me. He said they could narrow down the GPS ping to a more specific area if I wanted to file a formal request with law enforcement. While he was explaining the process, I grabbed my laptop and pulled up Google Maps, drawing mental circles around my house, trying to figure out where someone could park and still see into my windows. 3 blocks wasn't much in this neighborhood, mostly single-family homes with driveways, a few rental properties, and that small apartment complex on Cedar Lane that always had different cars coming and going. Anthony gave me a case number and said he'd personally flag this for their security team. And that's when he mentioned something that made my whole body tense up. "Sir, the GPS shows the phone has been stationary for the last 4 hours. It hasn't moved from its current position since around 6 this morning." I looked at the clock on my laptop. It was already past 10 in the morning. This person had been sitting somewhere nearby for 4 hours, just watching, texting, knowing exactly what I was doing inside my own house. I grabbed my car keys and told Anthony I was going to drive around the neighborhood, see if I could spot anything unusual. He tried to tell me to wait for the police, but I was already out the door, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I drove slowly down each street in a 3-block radius, looking for anyone sitting in their car, any vans with tinted windows, anything that seemed wrong. On my second loop, I turned onto Sycamore Road, 2 streets over from mine. And that's when I saw it. A beige Toyota Camry with Oregon plates parked perfectly to have a clear view down the gap between 2 houses, straight into my living room window. The car was running, exhaust visible in the cool morning air, and I could make out the dark silhouette of someone in the driver's seat, holding something up to their face that looked like binoculars, or maybe a camera with a long lens. I pulled up behind the Camry and sat there for maybe 10 seconds trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to call 911 right then, but another part needed to know who this was, needed to see their face. I got out of my car slowly, my phone recording video in my jacket pocket, and walked toward the driver's side window. The person inside must have seen me in their side mirror because they suddenly lowered whatever they were holding and started fumbling with something in the passenger seat. When I got close enough to see inside, my brain couldn't quite process what I was looking at. It was a woman, probably in her late 50s, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing what looked like medical scrubs. She had this whole setup on her passenger seat, a laptop, multiple notebooks, what appeared to be printed photos of my house from different angles, and a telephoto camera. She looked at me through the window with these pale blue eyes that seemed completely calm, almost serene, like we were meeting at a coffee shop instead of this insane situation. Before I could say anything, she rolled down the window halfway and spoke in this soft, measured voice that sounded like she'd rehearsed it. "Hello, Brian. I was wondering when you'd find me. My name is Dorothy and I used to live in your house. Well, not your house exactly, the house that was there before they tore it down and built yours." She pulled out a folder from between the seats and held it toward me with steady hands. "I grew up there. Lived there for 43 years until the bank took it in foreclosure 5 years ago. My husband died in the room where your living room is now. Cancer. Took him 14 months to go, and I sat with him every single day in that exact spot where your television is." Her voice never wavered, never showed emotion, just stated facts like she was reading a grocery list. Inside the folder were old photographs of a completely different house, a 2-story colonial with white siding and green shutters, and dozens of pictures of her family throughout the years. Birthdays, Christmases, a wedding reception in what was now my backyard. She explained how she'd been working as a home health aide since losing the house, how she'd saved every penny to try to buy it back, But the developer got there first and demolished everything. She'd watched them tear it down from this exact spot on Sycamore Road, she said, counted every swing of the wrecking ball. The personal details she knew about my divorce came from a paralegal at my lawyer's office, where she'd done overnight cleaning shifts for extra money. She'd read through papers left on desks, memorized details about the new owner who would be living where her life used to exist. The thing about Officer Dana came from her police scanner app, which she listened to religiously, especially when it involved the neighborhood. She showed me notebooks filled with observations about everyone who lived within a 5-block radius, their routines, their visitors, their Amazon delivery patterns. It wasn't just me. She had files on all the neighbors, but I was special because I was living in her space, sleeping where her children had slept, cooking where she'd made 43 years of dinners. I stood there on Sycamore Road for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 minutes, listening to her calmly explain how she'd figured out ways to see into the house from various angles, how she'd tested different positions until she found the perfect spot. She talked about the bathroom window like it was her greatest discovery, how the frosted glass created shadows that let her track movement through the house. When I told her I was calling the police, she just nodded and said she understood, that she'd been expecting it since the day I moved in. While we waited for them to arrive, she asked if she could have one more look at the house just from the street, and something in her voice finally cracked. Not much, just a tiny tremor when she said the word house. The police took her away quietly. No drama, no resistance. She was charged with stalking and harassment, and I got a restraining order that prevents her from coming within 500 feet of the property. But even now, 2 months later, I still check that bathroom window every morning, still feel exposed in my own living room, and sometimes I wonder if she's out there somewhere beyond that 500-foot line, still watching, still remembering the house that isn't there anymore. The divorce papers were still warm from the printer when I found the listing online, scrolling through real estate sites at 2 in the morning with a glass of whiskey that had gone watery from neglect. My 37th birthday was coming up in a week, and here I was, starting from scratch after 15 years of marriage. The house caught my eye immediately, not because it was beautiful, but because it was absurdly cheap. A 3-bedroom colonial in Riverside Heights for barely $120,000, with recently remodeled, stamped across the listing like a promise. The photos showed fresh paint, new fixtures, even granite countertops in the kitchen. I scheduled a viewing for that weekend, figuring the worst that could happen was wasting a Saturday afternoon. The realtor, a woman named Candace with platinum hair and nails that clicked against her clipboard, met me at the property on a humid Saturday in July. She seemed nervous, constantly checking her phone and rushing through the tour like she had somewhere else to be. The house smelled like fresh paint and carpet cleaner, almost overwhelming in its intensity. Every room had been gutted and redone. New drywall, new floors, everything pristine and sterile like a model home. When I asked about the previous owners, Candace just shrugged and said something vague about a job relocation. The price was firm, she said, and they wanted a quick cash sale. No inspections, no contingencies. I should have walked away right then, but desperation makes you stupid, and I needed somewhere to live before my ex-wife's patience ran out. I moved in 3 weeks later with nothing but boxes and regret. The first few months were actually peaceful. The neighbors kept to themselves. The house stayed cool despite the August heat, and I started to think maybe I'd gotten lucky for once. I set up my home office in the smallest bedroom, hung my pictures in the hallway, even bought a grill for the backyard. The neighborhood was quiet, full of older couples and young families who waved politely but never stopped to chat. It wasn't until early January, when I was shoveling snow from the driveway, that everything started to unravel. An elderly man from across the street, Walter something, shuffled over with his own shovel and started helping without asking. We worked in silence for a while before he mentioned, almost casually, how nice it was to see someone finally living in the house again after what happened to the Millers. The Millers. I stopped shoveling and asked him what he meant, playing dumb even though my chest had gone tight. Walter leaned on his shovel, his breath coming out in white puffs, and told me how the Miller family, a couple in their 40s with 2 teenage kids, had lived there for 8 years before vanishing one weekend the previous March. No moving trucks, no goodbye parties, just gone between a Friday night and Monday morning. Their cars were still in the driveway for weeks until someone finally towed them away. Mail piled up until the post office stopped delivering. Walter said he'd called the police after 2 weeks, worried something had happened, but they just said the family had relocated and the house was being sold. The weird thing, he said while scraping ice from his shovel blade, was that nobody ever saw the house go on the market. One day there were contractors gutting the place, and a month later, I was moving in. That conversation haunted me for days. I tried calling Candace, but her number was disconnected. The real estate company she supposedly worked for had no record of her when I called their main office. My stomach churned as I pulled out my closing documents, spreading them across the kitchen table under the harsh overhead light. Everything looked legitimate at first glance. Signatures, notary seals, official letterheads. But when I started making calls to verify, nothing checked out. The notary license number didn't exist. The title company had no record of my transaction. The attorney listed on the papers had been disbarred 3 years ago. Even the bank account I'd wired my money to was registered to a shell company that dissolved the day after my payment cleared. I spent the next week diving deep into property records at the county courthouse, telling my boss I had the flu while I sat in that fluorescent-lit basement surrounded by dusty filing cabinets and ancient computers. The chain of ownership for my address was a maze of false leads and dead ends. According to official records, the Millers still owned the house. There was no transfer deed, no sale documentation, nothing. But when I dug deeper, even their ownership became questionable. The deed from when they bought the house in 2014 referenced a previous owner who, according to death certificates, had been dead for 6 years at the time of sale. Every document led to another impossibility, another person who didn't exist or couldn't have signed what they supposedly signed. The recorder's office clerk, a thin man with thick glasses who'd been working there for 20 years, pulled me aside one afternoon and whispered that he'd seen this pattern before, always with houses where families had vanished, always in different counties, but the paperwork followed the same template. The revelation that hit me hardest came when I found a cached version of an old real estate listing from 2008. The photos showed my house, but the interior was different. Not just furniture and decorations, but the actual layout. Rooms that didn't exist anymore, a basement entrance where my pantry now stood, windows in places where I had solid walls. I printed everything and drove home in a daze, parking in my driveway as the sun set behind the identical suburban roofs. Inside, I walked through each room with the old photos in my hand, trying to match what I was seeing with what had been. That's when I noticed it. The dimensions were wrong. The house was smaller now, maybe by a third. Where had all that space gone? I grabbed a measuring tape and started checking walls, finding spots where the drywall sounded hollow in places that should have been exterior walls, places where the house should have ended but didn't. I became obsessed with the walls. Every night after work, I'd tap along them with my knuckles, listening for changes in sound, marking hollow spots with pencil. The master bedroom's east wall was the worst. It ran 15 feet longer than it should have according to the original blueprints I'd found. But from outside, the house looked normal. The math didn't work. I told myself I was losing it, that stress and paranoia were making me imagine things, but then I started hearing them. Muffled sounds from behind the walls at night. Not mice or settling wood, but deliberate sounds. Footsteps, breathing. Once I swear I heard someone crying, but it was so faint I couldn't tell if it was a child or an adult. I'd press my ear against the drywall and hold my breath, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sounds would stop the moment I got close. Like whoever was there could sense me listening. 3 weeks into my investigation, I couldn't take it anymore. At 2 a.m. on a Wednesday, armed with a hammer and a flashlight, I went to the master bedroom's impossible wall. The first hit cracked the drywall. The second punched through and a smell hit me. stale air mixed with something organic, like a closed room where someone had been living for too long. I pulled away chunks of drywall, my heart hammering against my ribs. Behind it was another layer of wall, older, with faded wallpaper showing tiny yellow roses. I kept going, demolishing a section about 2 feet wide, until I found it. A door, painted over so many times it almost blended with the wall. The doorknob had been removed, leaving just a hole filled with plaster. I clawed at the paint around the edges until I could get my fingers in the gap, and pulled. The door opened inward with a grinding sound, revealing a narrow hallway that shouldn't exist. The hallway stretched about 20 feet, lit by a single bulb that somehow still had power. The walls were covered in that same rose wallpaper, but sections had been torn away, revealing messages scratched directly into the drywall underneath. Names and dates going back decades. The Robertsons, 1987-1991. Jennifer and Kevin Huang, 1995-1999. The Millers, 2014-2023. Each family name I recognized from my research, people who had supposedly sold their houses and moved away. At the end of the hallway were 3 doors. The first opened to a small room with a chemical toilet, packages of food and water bottles, some empty, some still sealed. The second room had 4 mattresses on the floor, blankets neatly folded at the foot of each one. Children's toys were scattered in one corner, including a stuffed elephant with one eye missing. The third door was locked from the outside with a padlock that looked brand new. Behind it I could hear movement, shuffling feet, whispered voices that went silent when I touched the lock. I ran back through the hidden hallway, stumbling over my own feet, and grabbed bolt cutters from my garage. When I returned and cut the lock, the door swung open to reveal 4 people huddled in the corner of a windowless room. A man and woman in their 40s, and 2 teenagers, a boy and girl. They were thin, pale, wearing clothes that had been washed too many times. The woman started sobbing when she saw me. They were the Millers. They'd been living in the walls of their own house for almost a year, moved from room to room through a network of hidden passages, by someone who came every few days with food and water, someone who wore a mask and never spoke. The same person who'd approached them one night with a gun, forced them into the walls, then renovated their house around them, sealing them inside. They'd heard me living in their house, heard me watching TV in what used to be their living room, heard me on phone calls in their kitchen. They'd been too terrified to make noise because he'd threatened to kill them if anyone found out. But lately, they'd been getting desperate as the food deliveries became less frequent. I called 911 immediately, but even as I explained the situation, I knew how insane it sounded. The police arrived within minutes, followed by ambulances and what seemed like every news van in the state. The investigation that followed uncovered a network of properties across 6 states with similar hidden spaces, some still containing families who'd been missing for years. The person orchestrating it all was never caught. The fake documents were so sophisticated that federal investigators suspected multiple people were involved. Someone with access to government databases, someone in real estate, someone in construction. The Millers were relocated into witness protection after receiving death threats, and I moved out that same week, staying in hotels until I could find a legitimate apartment. The house on Riverside Heights was torn down a month later, revealing an elaborate maze of hidden passages between the walls. Sometimes I still wake up at night, wondering if the apartment I'm renting now has hollow spaces behind its walls, if someone might be living just inches away from where I sleep, watching, waiting, preparing documents with names that don't exist for the next person to move in. The lease paperwork showed my birth date clear as day, April 1989, which meant I'd turned 34 just weeks before signing. 34 and finally living alone for the first time in my life, if you can believe that. I'd spent years bouncing between roommates, then moved back home after my dad got sick, and by the time he recovered, I was desperate for my own space. The rental on Willow Creek Lane wasn't much. A small 2-bedroom cottage with peeling yellow paint and a chain-link fence. But it was mine. All mine. The landlord, Mr. Castellano, seemed nice enough during the showing. Older guy, maybe in his 60s, with reading glasses that hung on a chain around his neck, and a habit of jingling his keys while he talked. He told me he owned 4 properties in the area, all single-family homes he rented out to nice, quiet folks. I signed the lease that same afternoon, handed over first and last month's rent, and got my keys on a worn brass ring with a little blue tag that said Unit C, even though there was no Unit A or B anywhere in sight. The weirdness started small, the kind of thing you talk yourself out of noticing. I'd come home from my job at the veterinary clinic. I'm a vet tech, been doing it for about 9 years now, and the kitchen light would be on. Not a big deal, right? Maybe I'd left it on that morning in my rush to get out the door, but then it happened again. And again. Always the kitchen light, that ugly fluorescent fixture that buzzed like an angry wasp. I started making a point to check before I left. Even took a photo on my phone one morning to prove to myself I'd turned it off. When I came home that evening, it was blazing bright again. Then I noticed the deadbolt. I'm obsessive about locking up. Always have been ever since my apartment got broken into back in college. So I know for a fact I turn that deadbolt until it clicks. But I'd put my key in the lock and feel it turn just a fraction before catching, like someone had left it not quite locked. Just slightly turned back, maybe a quarter inch from fully engaged. It made this weird grinding sound, metal on metal, that set my teeth on edge every single time. I called Mr. Castellano on a Wednesday morning, trying to keep my voice casual even though my heart was doing this annoying flutter thing in my chest. Hey, just wondering, has anyone been coming by the house? Like for inspections or anything? There was a pause. Then that jingling sound of his keys in the background. Oh, sure, he said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. That's just Vincent, my maintenance guy. He checks the furnace filters, looks for leaks, that sort of thing. Standard stuff. I should have mentioned it in the lease, my apologies. He laughed, this wheezy sound that crackled through the phone. Vincent's been working for me for 15 years. Good guy. Very thorough. He has keys to all my properties. Something about the way he said very thorough made my stomach feel weird, but I thanked him and hung up. It made sense, I guess. Landlords did that kind of thing. Still, I wished he'd given me a heads up, maybe a schedule of when this Vincent guy was coming by. But the lights kept happening, and not just the kitchen anymore. I'd wake up at 2 in the morning to use the bathroom and see a glow coming from under my bedroom door. The hallway light blazing bright. I lived alone. I knew I hadn't gotten up and turned it on. One night I found the lamp in the living room on, the one by the bookshelf that I never used because it had this ancient bulb that flickered and gave me a headache. It was on when I came home from a late shift, throwing these weird shadows across the wall that looked almost like someone standing there. I checked every window, every door. Nothing seemed forced or broken. Everything locked up tight from the inside. I started keeping a log on my phone, just noting down every time something was off. March 15th, kitchen light on, deadbolt loose. March 18th, hallway light on at 2 a.m. March 22nd, living room lamp on, back door lock felt weird. I didn't know what I was going to do with this information, but it made me feel slightly less insane to have it written down somewhere. Then things got worse in a way that's hard to explain without sounding paranoid. Objects started moving. Not dramatically. I'm not talking about chairs stacked on tables or anything like that, but small things. My coffee mug, the blue one with the chipped handle that I always left on the right side of the sink, would be on the left. The throw pillows on my couch, which I arranged the same way every day, 2 on the left, 1 on the right, don't ask me why, it's just what I do, would be rearranged. 2 on the right, 1 on the left. The bathroom door, which I kept closed because the mirror inside faced my bedroom, and it creeped me out at night, would be standing wide open. I'd close it before bed, and by morning it was open again. My toothbrush moved from one side of the sink to the other. A framed photo of my dog Pepper, she died 2 years ago, still miss her like crazy, kept getting turned face down on my nightstand. That one really got to me. I'd stand it back up, and the next day it would be face down again, like someone was deliberately trying to mess with me. I called Mr. Castellano again, this time not even trying to hide the edge in my voice. "I need Vincent's schedule," I told him. "I need to know exactly when he's coming by because things are being moved in my house and it's freaking me out." Another pause, more key jingling. "Moved? What do you mean moved?" He sounded genuinely confused, which somehow made it worse. I explained about the lights, the locks, the objects. He made this sympathetic humming noise. "Honey, old houses settle. Doors swing open on their own. You probably just forgot where you put things. Happens to me all the time." I wanted to scream that I wasn't some scattered airhead who couldn't remember where she put her own coffee mug, but instead I just asked again about Vincent's schedule. "He doesn't really have one," Mr. Castellano said. "He just swings by when he's in the area. Could be morning, could be afternoon. I'll tell him to maybe leave you a note next time, how's that?" It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but I didn't know what else to say, so I just agreed and hung up. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house settling made me sit up in bed, staring at my bedroom door, waiting for the handle to turn. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in early April. I'd worked a double shift at the clinic. We'd had an emergency surgery on a Great Dane who'd eaten a bunch of socks, real mess, and I was absolutely exhausted. The kind of tired where your bones ache and your eyes feel like sandpaper. I came home around 11, threw my scrubs in the hamper, took the quickest shower of my life, and fell into bed without even checking my phone. I was asleep within minutes. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Not suddenly, not from a noise. Just that weird sense that something was different, that the air pressure in the room had changed somehow. My eyes opened and I lay there in the dark, perfectly still, listening. The house was silent, not even the hum of the refrigerator or the tick of the heating vent. Just pure, heavy silence that felt like it was pressing down on my chest. And then I heard it. The softest sound, barely there. Breathing, not my breathing. Someone else's breathing, slow and steady, coming from somewhere near the foot of my bed. My entire body went rigid. I didn't move, didn't even blink. I just lay there, straining my ears, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. But I wasn't. The breathing continued, patient and unhurried, like whoever it was had all the time in the world. I don't know how long I lay there, could have been 30 seconds, could have been 5 minutes. Time did this weird, stretchy thing where every heartbeat felt like an hour. The breathing eventually stopped, and I heard the faintest whisper of movement, like fabric brushing against fabric. Footsteps, so quiet I almost missed them, moving away from my bed toward the door. The click of my bedroom door closing, so gentle it barely made a sound. Then nothing. I waited another 10 minutes before I dared to move, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I thought I might pass out. When I finally reached over and turned on my bedside lamp, my hands were trembling so badly I almost knocked it over. The room was empty, door closed, everything exactly as it should be. But on my dresser, the little jewelry box I kept there, my grandmother's antique one with the painted roses, was open. I never left it open, ever. Inside, my necklaces were tangled together in a way they hadn't been before, like someone had been running their fingers through them. I grabbed my phone and sat with my back against the headboard until the sun came up, lights blazing in every room, checking the lock on my bedroom door every few minutes, even though I knew it didn't have one. The next morning, I didn't call Mr. Castellano. I didn't trust him anymore. Didn't trust his excuses about Vincent or settling houses or my own faulty memory. Instead, I drove to a Best Buy 30 minutes away and bought a hidden camera. One of those little wireless ones that looks like a phone charger and connects to an app on your phone. Cost me almost $200. Money I really didn't have, but I didn't care. I needed to know. I set it up on my dresser that afternoon, angling it toward my bedroom door so it would catch anyone coming in. The app would send me a notification if it detected motion, and it recorded everything to a cloud server. I tested it a few times, walking in and out of frame, watching the footage on my phone. Perfect. Crystal clear, even in low light. That night I went through my normal routine. Dinner, shower, double-checked every lock in the house, but instead of going to bed I took 2 Benadryl to knock myself out. I know that sounds stupid, making myself unconscious when I was scared someone might come in, but I needed them to think everything was normal. I needed them to show up, and I needed proof. The notification woke me up at 1:47 a.m. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen lighting up with the alert, motion detected in bedroom. My pulse started racing immediately, that horrible adrenaline dump that makes your whole body feel electric. I opened the app with shaking fingers. Okay, my hands were shaking, I'll admit that, and watched the live feed. The angle showed my bedroom door, and as I watched, the handle turned, slowly, carefully, like someone was trying not to make noise. The door opened, and a figure stepped inside. The video quality was good enough that I could see details even in the darkness. It was a man, average height, wearing jeans and a dark jacket. But here's the thing that made my throat close up. It wasn't some stranger. It was Mr. Castellano, my landlord. The same guy who'd been telling me it was just Vincent, the maintenance man. He stood in my doorway for a few seconds, completely still, just looking into my room. Then he stepped further inside, moving with this careful precision that told me he'd done this before. Many times before. He walked to the side of my bed, my side, the left side where I was currently pretending to be asleep, and just stood there, watching me. I could see him on my phone screen, this dark silhouette looming over where I lay, and I had to bite my lip to keep from making a sound. He stood there for what the timestamp later showed was 4 minutes and 37 seconds. 4.5 minutes of him just standing beside my bed, staring down at me while I pretended to sleep. At one point, he leaned down slightly, and I swear I could feel the displacement of air near my face. My eyes were squeezed shut under the blanket, my breathing measured and slow even though my heart was trying to pound its way out of my chest. Through my phone screen, which I had tilted just enough to see while keeping it hidden under my pillow, I watched him reach out. His hand hovered over my hair, which was spread across the pillow, and for a horrible second I thought he was going to touch me. But he pulled back. He straightened up, turned slowly, and walked to my dresser. The jewelry box. He opened it. That same painted rose box, and I watched him sift through the necklaces, picking up a silver chain my mom had given me for my 21st birthday and holding it up to what little light came through the window. Then he put it back, closed the box, and moved to my closet. He opened the door, which I always kept closed, and just stood there looking at my clothes for another minute. The whole time, his movements were casual, unhurried, like he was browsing a store, like he had every right to be there. Finally, he walked back to the door, paused to look at me one more time, and left. I heard the soft click of the front door lock engaging a minute later. I waited until I saw his car pull away. I jumped up and looked out the window, watched his old Buick sedan disappear down Willow Creek Lane, before I let myself fall apart. I sat on my bathroom floor and cried for 20 minutes straight, that ugly kind of crying where you can't catch your breath and your whole face gets splotchy. But then I stopped. I washed my face, drank a glass of water, and got angry. Really, truly angry. That footage was saved to the cloud. I had him. Clear as day, breaking into my house, standing over me while I slept. I downloaded the video file, backed it up in 3 different places, and at 8 a.m. sharp, I walked into the police station 2 blocks from the clinic. The officer who took my report, Officer Huang, this young woman who couldn't have been more than a few years out of the academy, went pale when I showed her the footage. "Jesus Christ," she muttered, watching Mr. Castellano loom over my bed. "How many times do you think he's done this?" I showed her my log of all the lights and moved objects going back to mid-March. "At least 20 times, I said, maybe more before I started keeping track. They arrested him that afternoon. Turned out I wasn't the first tenant to complain about weird things happening, but I was the first one with proof. When they searched his house, they found keys to all his rental properties, labeled and organized in a drawer. They also found photos. Polaroids of women sleeping. Different women, different rooms, but all the same terrible violation. The prosecutor told me later there were pictures going back at least a decade. I moved into that apartment with a sense of relief more than excitement. After a messy breakup, I just wanted somewhere quiet, a place where no one knew me, where I could close the door and not think about anyone else's noise or drama. It was a small 2-bedroom unit in an old building on the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled faintly of dust and pine cleaner even after you'd been there for a week. The landlord, a polite older man named Harold, had seemed straightforward. He handed me the keys, made a few jokes about the quirky plumbing, and wished me luck. I remember thinking he looked tired but harmless. The first few nights were normal enough. I unpacked, worked remotely, and tried to make the space feel mine. The walls were painted a flat beige, the kind that hides cracks if you do not look too closely. I hung string lights, set up my laptop on the kitchen table, and streamed old sitcoms to keep the silence from feeling too heavy. But something about the apartment's stillness began to gnaw at me. Every creak in the ceiling sounded deliberate, like the wood shifting just a little too rhythmically, as if reacting to my movements. By the end of the first week, I noticed something strange near the vent above my bed. It was a tiny mark, smaller than a grain of rice, right at the edge of the metal slats. I thought it was just a nail hole or maybe a dent from a screwdriver. But when I looked closer, it was perfectly circular. A little too clean. My stomach tightened as I leaned closer and saw a dark dot in the center, like the lens of a camera. I laughed out loud at myself for even thinking that. Who would hide a camera there? Still, once the idea lodged itself in my head, it would not leave. 2 days later, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a screwdriver and decided to check one of the light switch plates in the hallway. That's when I noticed the same kind of hole just above the screw, a pin-sized opening that looked identical to the one by the vent. I hesitated for a long moment, standing there barefoot in my hallway, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But I unscrewed the plate anyway. Behind it was a thin wire, black and almost invisible against the dry wall. It ran upward into the wall cavity. My hands felt clammy. I followed the wire as far as I could without breaking anything, and it disappeared straight into the ceiling. I could not stop thinking about that wire. The next morning, I borrowed a stepladder from my neighbor, a friendly woman named Denise who lived across the hall. She laughed when I said I needed it to check something weird in the ceiling, probably assuming it was a light fixture problem. When I climbed up and opened the narrow attic hatch above the hallway, a gust of warm, stale air hit me. The smell was awful, like old insulation and something metallic. I pulled my phone's flashlight app on and aimed it around. That was when I saw it. A small device taped near the vent shaft, with a faint red light blinking once every few seconds. At first, I thought it might be part of the building's security system. But as I got closer, I saw the thin antenna and a label with a Wi-Fi network name printed in tiny letters. The name didn't match my router or any neighbor's connection I recognized. My heart began racing. I gently pulled the tape back and revealed a pinhole-sized camera lens attached to a transmitter the size of a deck of cards. There was dust around it, but it looked far too new to belong in an attic like that. Someone had put it there deliberately. I spent the rest of the day spiraling between disbelief and panic. Every vent, every outlet cover, every smoke detector suddenly felt like a threat. I tried to tell myself it was some weird leftover security setup from a previous tenant. But when I emailed the property manager, they told me the building didn't even have central surveillance. That night, I barely slept. I unplugged my Wi-Fi, turned off every light, and sat in the dark with my phone flashlight aimed at the ceiling. Every sound, pipes clicking, the refrigerator cycling, made me flinch. The following morning, I called the police. 2 officers arrived within an hour, one of them carrying a small inspection camera. They went through the attic and my walls more carefully than I had. When they came down, they looked disturbed. One of them said quietly, "Ma'am, there are multiple devices up there." They counted 6 tiny cameras, all hidden behind vents and light fixtures. Each one was wired to a transmitter pointed toward the street. They said the signal likely bounced to a nearby receiver. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, clutching a coffee mug just to keep my hands occupied, while they made calls for a warrant. They came back later that evening with a detective and a technician who specialized in digital forensics. The technician carried a small scanner and a portable monitor. He climbed into the attic again, and within minutes he called down that the devices were broadcasting an open feed. When he patched into the signal, the detective's expression hardened. The live footage showed my bedroom. The bed, the dresser, the nightstand, everything. My knees went weak. The technician muted the screen quickly, but the image burned into my head. I had been living there for nearly 3 weeks. The next few hours felt surreal. They traced the Wi-Fi transmitters and determined the signal had been routed through a small server found behind a wall panel in the basement. It wasn't connected to the building's main network. It had its own separate line running outside the property. The detective asked if I had any information about the landlord before Harold. That was when I remembered. The previous owner had passed away, and Harold had been managing the property for only a year. The detective exchanged a look with his partner and told me they'd need to bring him in for questioning. The building was treated as a crime scene for 2 days. I stayed with a friend across town while investigators removed drywall and collected the hidden devices. Every new discovery made the situation worse. They found microphones too, tucked behind wall outlets and vents. Apparently, the footage had been streaming to a private server that linked to a subscription-based website. The detective later told me that some of the recordings had timestamps going back months before I even moved in. I could not wrap my head around it. How many people had lived there unaware? When Harold was finally arrested, it barely felt real. He had admitted to installing the equipment himself, claiming it was for security reasons. But the footage told a different story. Investigators said he'd been watching tenants for entertainment and selling access to the feed online. The thought of strangers sitting somewhere, watching me sleep, watching me change clothes, made me nauseous. The apartment no longer felt like a place I had lived in. It felt like a set, a stage. Every moment of privacy had been a lie. I eventually had to go back to pack my things. Even though the police had already cleared the place, I could not bring myself to be alone inside. Every time I stepped through the door, it felt like eyes were still hidden somewhere behind the walls. I remember moving in silence, stuffing clothes into boxes as quickly as possible. The vents, the light switches, even the mirror in the bathroom made my skin crawl. When I finally locked the door for the last time, it was like shutting a chapter I wanted to erase but never could. The detective called me a few weeks later to update me. They had traced the streams to several online forums where Harold had uploaded live feeds under fake usernames. Some of the viewers had even paid him through cryptocurrency. He faced multiple charges, including invasion of privacy and illegal surveillance. Hearing that gave me a strange mix of anger and vindication. It was horrifying, but at least it meant someone was finally being held accountable. I still check my ceiling vents in every new place I live. I can't stop myself. Even now, I catch myself thinking about all the moments that camera must have seen. The phone calls I made to my mother, the nights I cried after work, the times I danced around the kitchen while cooking, moments that were supposed to be mine. It's strange how easily trust can be destroyed by something you can't even see. I learned more about paranoia in that 1 month than I had in my entire life. Sometimes people on forums ask me why I didn't notice sooner, how I could have missed something like that. The truth is, you never imagine your home being a stage for someone else's entertainment. You never think to question the silence or the air vent above your bed. But once it happens to you, once you've lived inside that kind of invasion, you never unsee it. Even when I close my eyes, that little red light in the attic still blinks in the dark. When I first bought the old place on Brookside Lane, I thought I'd gotten lucky. It was a one-story house from the 1960s, recently restored but still had that quiet charm. Wood paneling in the living room, mint green tiles in the kitchen, and a faint smell of cedar from the closets. The previous owner had passed away years earlier, and the house sat empty until a small company flipped it. It felt solid, clean, and strangely peaceful. The kind of place you settle into after a long stretch of bad apartments. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfectly normal. I had gone down to the city office to get some of the old blueprints, just out of curiosity. I wanted to know how the wiring was laid out because I planned to add recessed lights in the hallway. The clerk printed out a copy for me and even joked that I was brave to live in one of those relics. I unfolded the blueprints at my kitchen table that night and immediately noticed something strange. According to the diagram, the house was supposed to have 4 bedrooms, not 3. The extra one was marked right between the hallway bathroom and the guest room, but there was nothing there in real life except a long stretch of wall. At first, I assumed it was just an old plan. Maybe the layout changed during renovations decades ago. Still, it bothered me. I walked down that hallway with the blueprint in hand, measuring the distance between the doors. The math did not add up. There was a solid 6-foot gap that led nowhere. The wall in that section felt different. The paint was newer, smoother, like it had been redone recently. I knocked once, then again, and the sound that came back wasn't the solid thud of drywall backed by studs. It was hollow, deep, and echoing, like the other side was empty. That was the moment a weird kind of curiosity took hold. I grabbed a flashlight and a small hammer, thinking I'd just open a small hole to check. The first tap cracked the paint, and a small puff of dust fell out. I made a fist-sized opening, shone the flashlight through, and saw tiles. White tiles. I could tell from the shine that it was some kind of bathroom or laundry area, but the blueprint had listed it as a bedroom. That inconsistency set my nerves on edge. Still, I kept going, widening the hole until I could squeeze through. The air inside that hidden space was heavy, like it had been sealed for decades. My flashlight beam caught dust swirling in the air, and I realized the room was smaller than expected, barely big enough for a single bed and a small nightstand. The tiles covered not just the floor but halfway up the walls, the kind you'd see in old hospitals. Some of them were cracked and discolored. When I stepped in, the echo of my own movement bounced weirdly around, like the sound had nowhere to escape. It gave me a strange sense that the place had been meant to contain something, not just house it. The strangest detail was a metal bracket on the wall, right where a bed's headboard would have gone. The floor beneath it had dark stains, faded but clearly there, spreading out in irregular shapes. My mind tried to rationalize. Maybe paint, maybe rust. But deep down I knew it wasn't that. I crouched down and noticed tiny fragments stuck in the grout, dark reddish-brown that had turned almost black. The smell there was faint but distinct, a sour metallic trace that no renovation could have completely erased. Then I noticed the camera. It was small, old-fashioned, the kind with a thick lens and a wire running behind the tiles into the wall. It pointed directly toward the spot where the bed had once been. I remember standing there, staring at that lens for a long time, like I expected it to suddenly blink to life. My flashlight caught a faint engraving on the camera's metal frame. Security Vision 1984. It wasn't a modern installation. Someone had put that there long before the house was ever flipped or repainted. I pulled back, uneasy now, and started searching for where the wire led. It disappeared behind a false panel near the floor. When I pried it open, I found an old junction box with 2 disconnected cables and a stack of yellowed photos wrapped in plastic. My hands hesitated before opening it, but curiosity got the better of me. The photos showed that same room, same tiles, same bracket, but with a bed in place and a person lying on it. The images were grainy and colorless, but one thing was clear. Whoever took them had been watching, not documenting. I backed out of that room and sat on the hallway floor for what felt like hours. Every sound in the house suddenly seemed sharper. The creak of wood, the hum of the fridge, even the faint wind outside. I sealed the opening with a tarp that night, too unsettled to look at it again. I called a friend, Caleb, who worked in construction, and asked him to come by the next morning. I did not tell him everything, just that I had found a hidden room. He laughed at first, said old houses always had weird surprises. That laugh faded the moment he stepped inside and saw the stains. Caleb wanted to take the camera apart, but I stopped him. I felt like disturbing anything else would somehow make things worse. We ended up patching the wall temporarily. covering the entrance with a sheet of plywood until I decided what to do. That night, I slept in the living room with every light on. Around 3 in the morning, the smoke detector started beeping, the low battery kind of sound. But when I climbed on a chair to remove it, I realized it wasn't the detector at all. The sound was coming from inside the wall, near where the hidden room was. The next day, I hired an electrician to trace the old wiring. He found that one of the cables from that sealed space connected to an outlet behind my bedroom dresser, a hidden line that shouldn't have existed. He said it looked like someone had tapped into the power decades ago, possibly to run surveillance equipment. That same afternoon, I went back to the city office and asked about the previous owner. The file showed the name Evelyn Morris. She had lived there from 1967 to 1994, then vanished from local records. No sale, no forwarding address, nothing. The clerk said it was probably a clerical error. It did not feel like one. I moved out 2 weeks later. The real estate agent asked why I was selling so soon, and I just told her I was relocating for work. A few days before I left, I walked through the house one last time. The plywood over the wall looked harmless, almost neat, like it belonged there. But as I turned off the lights and closed the front door, I heard something faint from the hallway. A quiet click, like an old camera shutter being pressed once. I never went back. Buying that old house felt like the best decision I had made in years. I wanted a project, something to keep my mind busy after the divorce, and the place had charm even beneath the dust and peeling paint. It was a one-story ranch house on the edge of town, the kind of property realtors describe as having good bones. The kitchen, though, was a nightmare. Dark cabinets, yellow linoleum, and a faint smell of mildew no matter how much I scrubbed. I spent most evenings after work tearing out the old fixtures myself, blasting a little classic rock through a Bluetooth speaker, and pretending I knew what I was doing. The strange part started on the 3rd week of renovations. I had just removed the cabinet under the sink when I noticed that the wall behind it didn't look quite right. The paneling sat slightly uneven compared to the rest, and when I knocked on it, it gave a dull, hollow sound. It was too small to hide anything major, maybe old wiring or a forgotten pipe access, but curiosity got the better of me. I fetched a screwdriver and pried it loose, expecting insulation or maybe a mouse nest. What I found instead was a narrow gap, barely wide enough for me to squeeze my shoulders through, leading into darkness. The air inside that space was thick and stale, like a basement that had been shut for decades. My flashlight beam shook against rough wooden beams and dust dancing in the light. The crawl space stretched about 8 feet deep, tapering toward the foundation, and right away I spotted something strange near the far end. A small pile of objects stacked neatly against the wall. Old photographs were scattered across the floor, black and white prints curled at the edges, and a faded pink dress small enough to fit a 6-year-old lay draped over a wooden crate. The sight stopped me mid-movement. Whoever had left these things there hadn't meant for them to be found. I crawled closer, brushing aside spider webs, and lifted one of the photos. It showed a group of children playing on a front lawn, their faces smudged with age but still visible. One girl had a distinctive birthmark across her cheek, shaped like a crescent moon. There were several more photos, birthday parties, school portraits, family snapshots, but none looked recent. Beneath them sat a sealed metal box about the size of a shoebox, heavy and cold to the touch. The latch was rusted but intact. I hesitated for a moment, then pried it open with my screwdriver, expecting old letters or coins. Instead, I saw several disposable flip phones lined up like artifacts in a museum. Each phone was labeled with a strip of masking tape, handwritten numbers and faded blue ink across the backs. The batteries had been removed, but one of the compartments still held a SIM card. My flashlight caught a reflection off something scratched into the metal lid. 3 letters and a date so faint I could barely make them out. It looked like initials, maybe someone's way of keeping track. My first thought was that it belonged to the previous owner, some paranoid collector or amateur detective. But the more I stared, the more uneasy I felt. Why hide burner phones behind a wall? I brought the box into the kitchen, wiped my hands on my jeans, and sat on the dusty floor just staring at it. Curiosity overrode common sense. I turned one of the phones over in my hand, wondering if I could get it to power on. Most of the devices looked identical, the same cheap silver model popular in the early 2000s. The serial numbers were still legible though, etched into the plastic beneath the battery slots. Out of habit, I snapped a photo with my own phone, mostly because I wanted to figure out the brand later, maybe post about it on a repair forum. Later that night, I searched a few of the serial numbers online. It was just idle curiosity at first, but one of the results stopped me cold. The exact same sequence appeared in a scanned PDF of a local newspaper article, an old piece about an unsolved child abduction case from the same county. The article mentioned that authorities had found a disposable phone near the scene, its serial number partially linked to several others believed to be connected. I remember scrolling back and forth between my photo and the document multiple times, comparing every digit until there was no doubt. It was the same number. I barely slept that night. Every sound in the house felt louder, more deliberate. The groan of settling wood, the tick of the refrigerator, even the wind pushing against the siding. When morning came, I decided to call the sheriff's office. I half expected them to dismiss me or tell me to drop the box off for evidence, but the woman who answered transferred me almost immediately to an investigator. He asked me to stay put and not touch anything until someone arrived. His tone wasn't casual. It carried the kind of clipped urgency that makes your heartbeat feel uneven. 2 deputies showed up less than an hour later, their patrol car crunching over the gravel driveway. One of them, a tall man with a weathered face and sunburned neck, introduced himself as Detective Lang. They asked me to walk them through everything, how I found the space, what I touched, and whether anyone else had been inside the house since I bought it. Lang kept glancing toward the crawl space like he already knew what they would find. When he finally crouched down and aimed his flashlight inside, he muttered something under his breath and asked his partner to photograph the area before moving anything. The next few hours blurred together. They collected the box, bagged the clothing, and took the photographs for evidence. I signed a short statement, then sat at my dining table while they made calls on their radios. One of them mentioned the name of a detective from an old task force, someone who had retired years ago, but had worked that abduction case. Hearing them say that out loud, confirming the connection, made the whole thing shift from eerie curiosity to something heavy and personal. That missing child had been around the same age as my niece. Over the following week, the sheriff's office kept in touch. They ran the serial numbers and confirmed several phones matched devices listed in old evidence logs. A local paper even ran a small update about new findings in a cold case but left my name out of it, thankfully. I tried to keep working on the house, but every hammer strike echoed through me like a pulse. I started avoiding the kitchen after dark. It was not the crawl space that bothered me anymore. It was the thought that someone had stood in that exact spot years ago, hiding those things piece by piece. About 10 days later, Detective Lang came back alone. He said the investigation was ongoing, but there was something else they had found. One of the phones still contained fragments of text messages recovered from a backup server, short messages, mostly numbers and meeting points. He did not give me details, but his expression changed when I asked if they had found out who used the house before me. He told me quietly that the property had changed hands twice since the early 2000s, and that one of the prior owners had left abruptly, abandoning most of their belongings. That phrase stuck in my head long after he drove away. The house grew quieter after that visit, though not in a comforting way. I would wake in the middle of the night convinced I heard movement under the floorboards, soft and deliberate, like someone shifting their weight. I told myself it was the pipes or the settling foundation, but once you connect a home to a crime like that, every sound becomes suspect. I thought about selling, even called a realtor, but something held me back. It felt wrong to walk away before knowing the full truth. A few weeks later, I received a call from the sheriff's office. They had identified fingerprints on the inside of the metal box, prints belonging to one of the victim's family members. It turned out that the mother of the missing child had worked briefly for the family who owned my house decades earlier. She used to clean there on weekends, sometimes bringing her daughter along. The phones, the photos, even the clothing, they all connected to a time when several children vanished from nearby towns. They believed my crawl space had been used to hide communication devices between whoever orchestrated those disappearances. That revelation should have brought closure, but it did the opposite. Knowing that I had been living above a space once used for something that vile made the air in that kitchen impossible to breathe. I tore out the rest of the cabinets, had the entire crawl space sealed with concrete, and replaced the flooring. For a while, I tried to convince myself that normal life could return, that the house could still feel like mine. But even after repainting, reflooring, and filling the place with light, the silence underneath it never felt empty. Last month, I finally moved out. I did not bother selling the property. I just rented it out to a young couple who seemed thrilled by the low price. I told them about the renovations, not the history. Part of me wonders if I should have warned them, but another part hopes they never find that panel, or the things buried beneath it. I still drive by sometimes on my way home from work. The lights glow through the kitchen window now, warm and normal. Still, every time I pass, I slow down just a little, half expecting to see that loose panel leaning open again. Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Nora and I left Denver on a Wednesday afternoon in November of 2022, heading south toward Albuquerque, where her sister lived with her husband and 2 kids. We had been married 6 years by then, and this Thanksgiving trip had become something of a tradition for us, a chance to escape our routines and spend a few days with family before the chaos of December set in. I had just clocked out from the warehouse where I had worked since finishing school back in 2014, and Nora picked me up right at the gate so we could hit the road without wasting any time. She was the planner between the two of us, the one who mapped out rest stops and calculated arrival times down to the minute, and she had a whole system for these drives. Cooler packed with sandwiches and fruit, thermos of black coffee, a playlist of true crime podcasts queued up on her phone. I loved watching her in those moments before a trip, the way she double-checked everything and made little notes in the margins of her printed directions. That afternoon, she was wearing my old college sweatshirt and had her hair pulled back in a messy bun. And I remember thinking how lucky I was to have found someone who still made me smile after all those years together. She kissed me on the cheek as I slid into the driver's seat and told me we would be at her sister's place by sunrise. We crossed into New Mexico around 9 that evening, the landscape growing darker and more sparse with every mile south of Raton. The highway cut through hills and valleys that seemed to swallow the light, and there were stretches where the only thing visible was the white line at the edge of the road and the faint glow of distant ranch lights. Nora had dozed off somewhere around 10, her head tilted against the passenger window with my jacket rolled up beneath her cheek. I kept the radio on low, some local station playing old country songs interrupted by static whenever we passed through a dead zone. The temperature outside had dropped into the low 30s, and I could feel the cold seeping through the gaps in the car's old weather stripping. We were driving a Subaru Outback that had belonged to my father before he passed, and it had close to 200,000 miles on it but still ran like a dream. Around 11:30, somewhere on a lonely stretch of I-25 between Raton and Las Vegas, New Mexico, I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror approaching fast. A dark pickup truck pulled up alongside us, and the driver started honking his horn while gesturing frantically toward the back of our car. I slowed down and rolled my window part way, squinting against the cold wind that rushed into the cabin. The man in the truck was yelling something I could not quite make out, but he kept pointing at our rear tire and making a slashing motion with his hand. Nora stirred awake beside me, blinking in confusion as she tried to understand what was happening. I told her someone was flagging us down, said it looked like we might have a flat or something dragging underneath. She rubbed her eyes and leaned forward to peer out the windshield at the truck that had now pulled ahead of us. The driver had his hazards on and was slowing to a stop on the wide shoulder about 50 yards up the road. I remember hesitating for just a second, something in my gut telling me to keep driving, but the logical part of my brain took over. If we really did have a flat tire, driving on it would destroy the rim and leave us stranded in an even worse spot. I pulled off behind the truck, our headlights illuminating the back of a mud-splattered Dodge Ram with New Mexico plates. The man stepped out and walked toward us, and I could see now that he was tall, maybe 6'3" or 4", wearing a denim jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. I told Nora to stay in the car and keep the doors locked while I checked things out. She nodded, still half asleep, and I stepped out into the freezing night air with my phone flashlight ready. The man met me halfway between our vehicles, and up close I could see he was somewhere in his 40s, with a thick neck and hands that looked like they had spent decades doing hard labor. He had a friendly enough smile, the kind that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and he told me he had been driving behind us for a few miles and noticed sparks coming from our back left tire. I thanked him and walked around to check, crouching down to get a better look. The tire seemed fine to me, fully inflated, no visible damage, no loose hubcap or anything that would cause sparks. I stood up and turned to tell him it looked okay, and that is when I saw he had moved much closer than before. He was standing maybe 3 feet away now, his smile gone, replaced by an expression I still cannot describe properly. It was blank, completely empty, like a mask someone had forgotten to put features on. I asked him if he saw which tire it was, trying to keep my voice steady, and he just tilted his head slightly to one side without answering. The next few seconds happened so fast that my memory has broken them into fragments, like photographs shuffled out of order. I remember turning back toward our car, wanting to put distance between myself and this man whose whole demeanor had shifted into something predatory. I remember seeing Nora's face through the windshield, her eyes wide with alarm as she watched the scene unfold. And then I felt a hand grab my shoulder from behind, thick fingers digging into the muscle hard enough to leave bruises I would still have a week later. I spun around and saw something metal flash in the dim glow of the headlights, a blade about 6 inches long that he had pulled from somewhere inside his jacket. He did not say a word. He just swung at me in a horizontal arc aimed at my throat, and the only reason he missed was because I stumbled backward and tripped over my own feet. I hit the gravel hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me, and I heard Nora scream from inside the car. The man stepped over me like I was nothing more than an obstacle, his boots crunching on the frozen ground as he walked calmly toward the driver's side door, where Nora was fumbling with her phone. I scrambled to my feet, yelling for her to run, to get out the other side and run into the darkness where he could not follow. But she was panicking, her fingers not cooperating as she tried to unlock her phone and call for help. The man reached the car and slammed his fist against the window so hard, I thought the glass would shatter. Nora screamed again, and finally threw herself across the center console toward the passenger door. But she was tangled in the seatbelt she had forgotten to unbuckle. I ran at him from behind, not thinking, just reacting on pure adrenaline and terror. I tackled him around the waist and we both went down onto the pavement, the knife skittering out of his grip and sliding somewhere beneath our car. He was stronger than me, much stronger, and within seconds he had flipped our positions and pinned me to the ground with his knee on my chest. His face was inches from mine, and I could smell cigarette smoke and something sour on his breath as he wrapped both hands around my throat. The world started going gray at the edges, sounds becoming muffled and distant, and the last thing I saw before my vision tunneled was Nora finally bursting out of the passenger door and running toward the empty highway. Then his weight suddenly lifted off me, and I heard his footsteps pounding away in the direction she had gone. I lay there gasping for air, my throat burning and my vision slowly coming back into focus. Every breath felt like swallowing broken glass, and when I tried to call out for Nora, Only a rasping whisper came out. I forced myself onto my hands and knees, then staggered upright using the side of our car for support. The highway stretched out in both directions, empty and silent except for the wind howling across the open plain. I could not see Nora. I could not see the man. The darkness beyond our headlights was absolute, a wall of black that could have been hiding anything. I stumbled forward, following the direction I had seen her run, my legs barely cooperating as the adrenaline started to fade and the pain set in. I called her name over and over, my voice getting stronger with each attempt, but the only answer was the wind. About 200 yards from the car, I found her shoe, a white sneaker she had been wearing since we left Denver, lying on its side in the middle of the road. I picked it up and kept walking, kept calling, kept praying to a God I had not spoken to in years. I found her maybe 50 yards further, just off the shoulder where the gravel gave way to scrub brush and frozen dirt. She was lying on her back, completely still, her eyes open and staring at the stars. The front of her sweatshirt, my old college sweatshirt, was dark and wet in a way that I understood immediately but refused to accept. I dropped to my knees beside her and grabbed her hand, and it was still warm, still felt like her, but there was no pulse beneath my fingers. I kept saying her name, kept telling her to wake up, kept promising that help was coming and everything would be okay. But she did not blink. She did not breathe. The wound across her throat was deep, almost surgical in its precision, and the blood had already stopped flowing because there was none left to flow. I do not know how long I knelt there holding her hand in the freezing dark. It could have been 5 minutes or an hour. Time had stopped meaning anything at all. At some point, I became aware of headlights approaching from the north, a semi-truck that slowed as it passed our abandoned car, and then pulled onto the shoulder when the driver saw me kneeling in the brush. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s named Hank, and he called 911 while wrapping his own jacket around my shoulders because I had started shaking so violently I could barely speak. The police arrived first, 2 state troopers in separate vehicles with their lights painting the desert in alternating flashes of red and blue. Then came the ambulance, then more police, then a detective in an unmarked sedan who introduced himself as Sergeant Philip Reeves. I told them everything I could remember, my voice hollow and mechanical as I described the truck, the man, the fake warning about our tire. They took photographs of the bruises on my throat, the scrapes on my palms from hitting the gravel, the shoe I was still clutching in my hands like some kind of talisman. Someone draped a thermal blanket over me and guided me to the back of an ambulance where a paramedic checked my vitals and shined a light in my eyes. I watched from there as they set up a perimeter around Nora's body, as they photographed the scene from every angle, as they eventually covered her with a white sheet that seemed to glow against the dark ground. I kept expecting to wake up, kept waiting for the nightmare to end and find myself back in our apartment with Nora beside me, complaining that I had stolen all the blankets again. But the cold was too real, the pain in my throat too sharp, the image of her empty eyes burned too permanently into my memory. The investigation moved faster than I expected, though the days and weeks that followed are mostly a blur of police stations and funeral arrangements and phone calls I do not remember making. The pickup truck was found abandoned 2 days later at a rest stop near Santa Fe, wiped clean of fingerprints but not clean enough to erase everything. Forensic technicians pulled DNA from a cigarette butt in the ashtray and a partial fingerprint from the rearview mirror that the killer had missed. They matched both to a man named Boyd Driscoll, 44 years old, with a record of assault charges in 3 different states and a warrant out of Texas for a similar attack on a couple near Amarillo 2 years earlier. That couple had survived, barely, because another driver happened to pull over before Driscoll could finish what he started. The FBI joined the case when they connected him to at least 2 other highway attacks across the Southwest, a pattern of violence targeting travelers on isolated stretches of road late at night. They found him 17 days after Nora died, hiding in a trailer park outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, living under a fake name and working cash jobs at a nearby ranch. He did not resist when they came for him. According to the agents who made the arrest, he smiled when they read him his rights, like the whole thing was some kind of game he had finally gotten tired of playing. The trial took place in Albuquerque the following spring, and I sat in that courtroom every single day for 3 weeks straight. Nora's sister sat beside me, her hand gripping mine so tight it left marks, and together we listened as prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by piece. The DNA, the fingerprints, the testimony from the couple in Texas who identified Driscoll as the man who had attacked them on a lonely highway outside of Amarillo. I had to testify too, had to sit on that stand and describe every detail of the worst night of my life, while Driscoll watched me from the defense table with that same blank expression I remembered from the road. His lawyer tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that someone else could have been driving that truck, but the jury saw through it. They deliberated for less than 4 hours before coming back with a guilty verdict on all counts, including first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole, and when they led him out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he turned and looked directly at me. He did not say anything, did not smile, just stared for a long moment before the bailiffs pushed him through the door. I have seen that look in my dreams more times than I can count. It has been almost 2 years now, and I still cannot drive at night without feeling my chest tighten and my breathing go shallow. I sold the Subaru, sold our apartment, moved to a small town in Vermont where Nora and I had always talked about retiring someday. Her sister checks in on me every few days, sends me photos of her kids who are growing up so fast, reminds me that Nora would want me to keep living even when living feels impossible. I go to therapy twice a week and take medication that helps me sleep without dreaming. Some days are better than others. Some days I can almost convince myself that I am healing, that the weight on my chest is getting lighter, that eventually I will be able to remember Nora without seeing her lying in that frozen dirt with her eyes full of stars. But then I will hear a car horn honk unexpectedly, or see a dark pickup truck in a parking lot, or notice someone walking a little too close behind me, and all of it comes rushing back like it happened yesterday. I am sharing this because I need people to understand that these things happen to real people on ordinary nights, when they are just trying to get from one place to another. If someone flags you down on an empty road, do not stop. Keep driving. Call 911 and let them check it out. Because the 5 minutes you save by being a good Samaritan might cost you everything you have ever loved. Carla had been asleep for the last hour when everything changed. We were driving from Portland down to Sacramento for her cousin's wedding, a long haul we had decided to tackle in one shot to save money on a motel. She and I graduated together from Oregon State in 2015, got married 2 years later, and between her nursing shifts and my work as an electrician, we rarely found time for road trips anymore. That Thursday morning we left before sunrise, loaded the Subaru Outback with snacks and luggage, and watched the Pacific Northwest fade into California's golden hills. September had brought that perfect kind of weather, where the sun warms everything without making you sweat, and I drove with the window cracked open, listening to a true crime podcast while Carla napped with her head against the glass. We had planned everything down to the rest stops, charging cables and a cooler full of sandwiches. For the first 6 hours, the trip felt almost peaceful, like a small vacation before the chaos of wedding festivities. We were somewhere past Redding, deep into that desolate corridor where gas stations become rare, and the landscape turns to dry brush and brown hills, when I noticed the man on the shoulder. A silver pickup truck sat with its hood propped open, and beside it stood a figure waving his arms slowly, almost tiredly, like someone who had been at it for a while. I eased off the gas and Carla stirred awake, squinting through the windshield at the scene ahead. He looked ordinary enough. Jeans, a flannel shirt with rolled sleeves, a faded baseball cap pulled low over graying stubble. Maybe mid-40s, with the kind of weathered face you see on guys who work outdoors. His truck had California plates and a gym bag sat at his feet. Carla gave me a questioning glance, that silent conversation married couples have, and I pulled over about 50 feet past him. Broad daylight, cell service on my phone, and the guy seemed genuinely stuck. When I rolled down my window, he approached with a relieved expression and explained his fuel pump had failed. leaving him stranded for nearly 2 hours with nobody stopping to help. His name was Greg, or at least that is what he told us. He said he was heading to Stockton to visit his daughter, that he had been driving since morning and the truck just died on him without warning. The way he spoke seemed calm, polite even, with a slight southern drawl that made him sound friendly. He asked if we could give him a ride to the next town with a mechanic, maybe 20 or 30 miles down the road. Carla looked at me, and I could see her doing the mental math. Daylight, public highway, 2 of us versus 1 of him. I told Greg to grab his bag and hop in the back seat. He thanked us repeatedly, almost too much, and settled in behind Carla with his gym bag on his lap. As I pulled back onto the interstate, I caught a glimpse of him in the rear-view mirror, adjusting his cap and looking out the window. Nothing alarming, nothing strange. Just a guy who got unlucky with car trouble, or so I convinced myself in that moment. The first 15 minutes passed without incident. Greg made small talk about the weather, asked where we were headed, and mentioned he used to work construction before his back gave out. Carla, always the friendly one, engaged him with questions about his daughter, and he answered with the kind of vague details that seemed normal at the time. She was in college studying something with computers, lived with her boyfriend in an apartment near downtown. He spoke slowly, deliberately, and I noticed he kept glancing at my phone mounted on the dashboard, watching the GPS map as it tracked our route south. At some point, he asked how far we were from the next exit, and when I said about 12 miles, he nodded and went quiet. Carla shot me a look through the corner of her eye, the kind that said she was paying attention too. The silence in the car grew heavier, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, though I could not pinpoint exactly why. Things shifted when we approached the exit for a small town called Cottonwood. I signaled to take the off-ramp, figuring this would be a good place to drop Greg off and let him find a mechanic or call a tow truck. But before I could merge into the exit lane, his voice came from the back seat, sharper than before. "Keep going straight," he said. "This town is no good. Nothing open on Thursdays." I glanced at Carla, who had turned slightly in her seat to look at him. I told Greg this was the exit he had asked for, the next town with services, but he shook his head and insisted we continue to the one after. Something about a friend who worked at a garage there, someone who would give him a deal. His tone had changed, the friendly drawl replaced by something flatter, more insistent. I missed the exit, merging back into the flow of traffic, and watched in the mirror as Greg settled back into his seat with his hands resting on the gym bag. Carla reached over and squeezed my knee, a silent message that I understood completely. The next 20 minutes felt like hours. Greg started giving directions unprompted, telling me which lane to stay in, pointing out upcoming signs as if I could not read them myself. When I mentioned that the GPS showed a rest stop ahead with gas stations and food, he dismissed it immediately, saying those places were overpriced tourist traps and we should keep moving. His voice carried an edge now, not quite threatening, but firm in a way that left no room for discussion. Carla tried to ease the tension by offering him a bottle of water from our cooler, but he declined without looking at her, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I noticed his right hand had slipped inside the gym bag, resting there casually, and my mind started racing through possibilities I did not want to consider. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles from any town, with a stranger in our back seat who no longer seemed interested in being dropped off anywhere. I decided to test him. I announced that we needed gas, that the tank was getting low, and I would have to stop at the next station regardless of his opinion on tourist traps. Greg leaned forward between the seats, close enough that I could smell cigarette smoke on his clothes, and looked at the fuel gauge on the dashboard. "You got enough to make it another 40 miles, he said, his voice low and steady. "Trust me, there is a better spot up ahead. Cleaner bathrooms, cheaper gas, you will thank me." The way he said it was not a suggestion. Carla had gone rigid in her seat, her hand still on my knee but gripping harder now. I kept driving, my mind working through options that all seemed to end badly. If I pulled over and demanded he get out, what would he do? What was in that bag? The highway stretched ahead, empty and endless. No other cars in sight, Just brown hills and dead grass under a sky that suddenly looked too big and too indifferent. I thought about my phone, about calling 911, but Greg was right there, watching everything, and I could not risk making him feel cornered. He started talking about his life, unprompted, in a way that felt like a warning wrapped in conversation. He mentioned he had done time, casually, like he was discussing the weather. Said he had made mistakes when he was younger, got mixed up with the wrong people, spent a few years in a facility up north. People judge you for your past, he said, staring at the back of Carla's head. They see a record, and they think they know who you are. But sometimes a man just needs a break, you know? Sometimes he just needs people to help him get where he is going, without asking too many questions. Carla nodded slowly, not turning around, and I could see her chest rising and falling faster than normal. I mumbled something agreeable, playing along, buying time. Greg smiled at that, a brief flash of teeth in the rearview mirror, and patted the gym bag on his lap like it was a pet. You two seem like good people, he continued. Smart people. The kind who understand that some situations are better handled quietly. I felt sweat forming on my palms despite the air conditioning blowing cold, and I realized with horrible clarity that we were completely at his mercy. We had been driving for another 15 minutes when I spotted something ahead that changed everything. Red and blue lights flickered in the distance, a cluster of patrol cars parked along the shoulder with officers standing outside, setting up what looked like a checkpoint. My heart jumped, and I saw Carla sit up straighter, hope flashing across her face for the first time in an hour. But Greg saw it too. He cursed under his breath and leaned forward again, his hand now fully inside the gym bag, gripping something I could not see. "Take the next exit," he hissed, his voice completely different now, all pretense of friendliness gone. "Do it now, before we get any closer." I looked at the GPS and saw an exit approaching in half a mile, a rural route that led into empty farmland with no towns marked for miles. My hands trembled on the wheel as I weighed my choices. If I took the exit, we would be alone with him on a deserted road with no witnesses. If I kept driving toward the checkpoint, I had no idea what he would do, what he would pull from that bag in desperation. Carla made the decision for me. She pointed at the dashboard and said, loud enough for Greg to hear, that the engine temperature was spiking, and we needed to pull over immediately or risk blowing the radiator. It was a lie. The gauge was fine, but she sold it with convincing panic in her voice. I understood instantly what she was doing. I flicked on the hazard lights and started slowing down, pulling toward the shoulder about a quarter mile before the checkpoint, close enough that the officers could see us but far enough that Greg might feel he had a chance to run. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rising. I told him the car was overheating, that I had no choice, that we would be stuck on the highway if I did not stop. He looked at the police lights ahead, then at the open fields beside us, calculating his options. For a long, terrible moment, I thought he was going to do something violent. I could feel it in the air, that electricity before a storm breaks. Carla was pressed against her door, ready to jump out the second the car stopped, and I had already decided I would throw myself at him if he made any move toward her. The car rolled to a stop on the gravel shoulder, and for 3 seconds nobody moved. Greg stared at the police lights, then back at us, then at the open field stretching toward a line of trees maybe 200 yards away. I kept my hands visible on the steering wheel, trying to look as non-threatening as possible, giving him no reason to escalate. "Stay in the car," he said quietly, almost to himself, and then he grabbed his gym bag and opened the rear door. He did not run at first. He walked quickly but deliberately, heading away from the highway toward the tree line without looking back. Carla grabbed my arm and we both stayed frozen, watching him go, neither of us willing to move until he was far enough away. When he reached the edge of the field, maybe 50 yards out, he finally broke into a jog and disappeared into the brush. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. Carla was shaking beside me, her face pale, and I pulled her into an awkward hug across the center console. We sat there for a minute, just breathing, just being alive and together and safe. One of the officers from the checkpoint approached our car a few minutes later. a tall woman with a calm demeanor who asked if we were having car trouble. I told her the truth, that we had picked up a hitchhiker who had grown threatening and had just fled into the field. Her expression changed immediately, and she radioed to her colleagues while asking us for a description. We told her everything we could remember: the flannel shirt, the baseball cap, the gym bag, the silver pickup truck with California plates abandoned back near Redding. She listened carefully, taking notes, and then told us something that made my entire body go cold. They were looking for someone matching that description in connection with an armed robbery 2 counties north, a gas station holdup where the clerk had been badly beaten. The man had carjacked a truck to escape and had been last seen heading south on this very highway. We had been driving for over an hour with someone capable of real violence, sitting 3 feet behind my wife. The officer took our contact information and told us we might be called as witnesses, then let us continue on our way. Carla and I did not speak for the next 50 miles. We just held hands across the console, the radio off, the only sound the hum of the engine carrying us toward Sacramento, and away from the worst day of our lives. Corey swore he could drive through anything, and we were all dumb enough to believe him. March 2023, spring break, and our little group had been on the road for almost 9 hours. Me riding shotgun, Corey behind the wheel of his dad's old Suburban, his girlfriend Megan in the middle row, and Dante and Lila crammed in the back with all our bags. We had graduated together the year before, class of 2022, and this Austin trip was supposed to be our big farewell before adult life pulled us apart. The plan seemed brilliant at the time. Drive through the night, skip the motel, save $100. The weather had started getting ugly somewhere past the Texas-Oklahoma border, but Corey just turned up the radio and Dante cracked open a bottle of whiskey he had smuggled from his older brother's cabinet. I took a drink when it came my way, felt the burn go down my throat, and laughed at something stupid Lila said. We were young, we were together, and the storm outside felt like nothing more than background noise to our little adventure. The rain got heavier around midnight. I was sitting in the front passenger seat, watching the windshield wipers struggle to keep up. The road we were on, some state highway I cannot even remember the number of now, was pitch black except for our headlights. No street lamps, no other cars, just endless darkness on both sides. Corey had been driving for almost 5 hours at that point, and I noticed his eyes were getting heavy. He kept rubbing his face and rolling down the window to let the cold air hit him. Megan suggested we pull over somewhere and rest for a few hours, but Corey waved her off. Said we were only 3 hours out, that stopping now would be stupid when we were so close. Dante laughed from the back and made some joke about Corey being a lightweight, and that was when Corey grabbed the whiskey bottle and took a long drink just to prove a point. I should have said something. I should have grabbed the wheel or demanded we stop. But I just sat there, watching the rain pound against the glass, telling myself we would be fine. Around 1 in the morning, Lila fell asleep against the window in the back. Megan had dozed off too, her head resting on a bundled-up jacket. Dante was scrolling through his phone, the blue light making his face look ghostly in the darkness. I remember feeling my own eyelids getting heavy, that dangerous pull of sleep when you have been awake too long. The heater was blasting, the car was warm, and the sound of the rain had turned into this constant white noise that made everything feel dreamlike. I pinched my arm a few times to stay alert, kept checking on Corey. He was blinking too much, that rapid flutter people do when they are fighting to stay conscious. I asked him if he wanted me to take over, told him I could drive the rest of the way. He shook his head, said he was fine, said we were almost there. The GPS showed 2 hours and 40 minutes remaining. I remember that number exactly because I stared at it, wondering if we would actually make it. The curve came out of nowhere. 1 second we were on a straight stretch of highway, and the next the road bent sharply to the left. There was a yellow warning sign, I think, but the rain was coming down so hard that Corey did not see it until we were right on top of it. He yanked the wheel, overcorrected, and suddenly the Suburban was sliding sideways across the wet asphalt. I heard Megan scream from behind me, this piercing sound that cut through everything. The tires made a horrible squealing noise as Corey tried to regain control, pumping the brakes the way you are not supposed to do on a slick road. Time stretched out in that weird way it does during a crisis. I could see every drop of rain frozen in the headlights, could feel my body pressing against the seatbelt as we spun. Then we hit the guardrail on the right side of the road, and the impact threw me forward so hard I thought my chest would cave in. The car did not stop at the guardrail. We went through it or over it, I still do not know which. All I remember is the sensation of falling, this sickening drop in my stomach as the Suburban left the road entirely. We rolled at least twice, maybe 3 times. Glass shattered everywhere. I heard Dante yelling something, heard metal crunching and twisting around us. My head slammed against the window, against the dashboard, against something hard that split my forehead open. Everything was spinning, tumbling, a chaos of sounds and pain and absolute terror. When the car finally stopped moving, we were upside down in a ditch, the engine still running, the headlights pointing at nothing but mud and broken branches. I was hanging from my seatbelt, blood dripping from my face onto the ceiling below me, and for a few seconds I could not hear anything except a high-pitched ringing in my ears. The first thing I became aware of after the ringing faded was Megan crying. Not screaming anymore, just these broken, gasping sobs that sounded like she could not catch her breath. I called out to Corey, but he did not answer. His body was slumped forward, held in place by his seatbelt, and his arms were dangling limp toward the crushed roof beneath us. I could see blood on his face, a lot of it, but I could not tell where it was coming from. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely find my seatbelt buckle. I kept pressing the button, over and over, but it was jammed or bent or something. The rain was still pounding outside, coming in through the broken windows, mixing with the blood on my face. I finally got my belt undone and dropped hard onto the ceiling, landing on broken glass and pieces of plastic from the dashboard. The pain in my shoulder hit me then, this sharp burning sensation that made me want to throw up. I think I dislocated it in the crash, but I did not know that yet. All I knew was that something was very wrong with my left arm. I crawled toward Corey first because he was closest. The whole front of the car was caved in, the steering wheel pressed up against his chest in a way that made my heart seize up. I grabbed his face, slapped his cheek a few times, kept saying his name like that would somehow wake him up. His eyes were closed, and there was a deep gash running from his hairline down to his eyebrow, blood pumping out in a steady rhythm that scared me more than anything. He was breathing, though. I could see his chest rising and falling in shallow little movements. Behind me, I heard Dante groaning and Lila calling out for help, her voice high and panicked. Megan had stopped crying and gone quiet, which was almost worse. I did not know what to do, did not know who to help first. We were in the middle of nowhere, upside down in a ditch, and none of us had any idea if help was coming or if we would just bleed out there in the dark. Dante managed to kick out the back window. I heard the glass give way and then saw him crawling out into the mud, dragging himself on his elbows because something was wrong with his legs. He was cursing the whole time, a steady stream of words I could barely make out through the rain. I turned back to check on Megan, and that was when I saw her arm. It was bent at an angle that arms do not bend, the bone pushing up against the skin like it was about to break through. She was conscious, but her eyes had this glazed, faraway look, like her brain had shut down to protect her from the pain. Lila was the least injured somehow, just cuts and bruises from what I could see. She climbed out after Dante and immediately started screaming for help into the darkness, her voice swallowed up by the storm. I stayed with Corey and Megan, trying to keep them both awake, talking to them about anything I could think of. I told Corey about the time we skipped class freshman year to go fishing. I told Megan about how Corey had talked about proposing to her after they both found jobs. Stupid things, desperate things, anything to keep them with me. My phone was destroyed. The screen cracked into a spider web of broken glass. Dante's phone had flown out of his hand during the crash and we never found it. But Lila still had hers, somehow, tucked into the pocket of her jacket. She called 911 and tried to explain where we were, but none of us knew. We had been on some state highway heading south toward Austin, but we could not remember which one or how far we had gone. The dispatcher kept asking for landmarks, for mile markers, for anything that could help them find us. All Lila could say was that we were in a ditch, that it was dark, that her friends were dying. That last word hit me like a punch to the chest. Dying. I had not let myself think it until she said it out loud. The dispatcher told us to stay on the line, said they would try to trace the call, told us to keep everyone as still as possible. The rain kept coming down and the minutes stretched into something that felt like hours. I held Corey's hand and watched his chest rise and fall, counting each breath like it might be his last. The ambulance took 47 minutes to find us. I know because Lila's phone showed the call duration when they finally arrived. 47 minutes of sitting in the rain, in the dark, watching my best friend slip in and out of consciousness. At some point, Megan started shivering uncontrollably, her whole body shaking despite the fact that it was not even that cold out. Shock. I know now. Her body was shutting down. Dante had dragged himself to a tree and was leaning against it, his face pale and his lips turning a bluish color that terrified me. When I finally saw the flashing lights up on the road, I started crying. Not quiet tears, but ugly, heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep in my chest. The paramedics had to rappel down into the ditch because it was too steep for a stretcher. They put a neck brace on Corey and strapped him to a board, and it took 4 of them to carry him back up to the road. I refused to leave until everyone else was out. Stood there in the mud with my dislocated shoulder and my bleeding head, watching them pull my friends out of that hole one by one. The hospital is a blur of fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell, and people asking me questions I could not answer. They popped my shoulder back into place without warning, and I screamed so loud a nurse came running from down the hall. 13 stitches in my forehead, a concussion, 2 cracked ribs I did not even know I had. But I was the lucky one. Dante had shattered both his kneecaps and needed surgery that same night. Megan's arm was broken in 3 places, and she had internal bleeding that required emergency surgery. Lila had a fractured collarbone and whiplash so bad she could not turn her head for weeks. And Corey, the one who had sworn he could drive through anything, was in a medically induced coma for 4 days. Traumatic brain injury, they said, swelling in his skull. They had to drill a hole to relieve the pressure. His parents flew in from Michigan, and his mom grabbed me by the shoulders in the waiting room, asking me what happened, asking me why we did not stop, asking me questions I have been asking myself every single day since. Corey woke up on the 5th day. He did not remember the crash, did not remember the curve or the rain or the guardrail. The last thing he recalled was passing the Texas border and Dante handing him the whiskey bottle. The doctor said that was normal, that the brain protects itself by erasing trauma. I wished my brain would do the same. Instead, I remember everything. The sound of Megan screaming, the way the car felt when it left the ground, the smell of blood and gasoline mixing with rain. Corey spent 3 weeks in the hospital and another 2 months in physical therapy, relearning how to walk in a straight line. Dante still walks with a limp, and probably always will. Megan never got full range of motion back in her arm. She and Corey broke up about 6 months after the accident, not because of any fight, but because every time she looked at him, she saw that night. That is what she told Lila anyway. Some things just break in ways that cannot be fixed. It has been almost 2 years now and I still cannot drive at night. The moment the sun goes down and I am behind a wheel, my chest gets tight and my vision starts to tunnel and I have to pull over before I have a full panic attack. I take medication for it, see a therapist every other week, do all the things you are supposed to do. But some nights I still wake up at exactly 1:47 in the morning, the time the crash happened according to the police report, and I am back in that ditch, hanging upside down, blood in my eyes. Corey not answering when I call his name. The 5 of us do not really talk anymore, not because anyone is angry, but because being together means remembering, means looking at Dante's limp or Megan's stiff arm, or the scar on my forehead and reliving the worst night of our lives. We saved $100 by not stopping at that motel. We saved $100 and it cost us everything else. I tell this story now because I need someone to understand that it can happen to you. One bad decision, one moment of thinking you are invincible, and suddenly you are upside down in the dark, wondering if you are going to die. Pull over. Get the motel. It is not worth it. Nothing is worth it. Patty and I had been married for 41 years. When we finally decided to take that cross-country trip, we kept postponing, since our youngest graduated college back in 2008. I had retired from the Postal Service 2 years prior, and she had just finished her last semester teaching 4th grade at Ridgemont Elementary. Our granddaughter Ellie was turning 5 in Arizona, and our son Craig kept insisting we make the drive out instead of flying. He wanted us to experience the open road, see the landscapes we had only talked about over dinner for decades. So we bought a used camper, a 2014 Winnebago Adventurer that still had good bones despite the faded exterior. We spent 3 weeks getting it road ready, checking every seal, every hose, every belt. Patty picked out new curtains, pale blue with little white flowers, and I installed a better radio system so we could listen to her audiobooks during the long stretches. We mapped our route carefully, planning stops at national parks and small diners that had good reviews online. We left Cedar Falls, Iowa on a Saturday morning in late September, the kind of day where the air smells like wood smoke and fallen leaves. Patty made egg sandwiches wrapped in foil for breakfast, and I filled 2 thermoses with black coffee. Our neighbors, Harold and Deb Winslow, waved from their porch as we pulled out of the driveway, the camper groaning slightly under the weight of everything we had packed. Behind us, we towed our old Subaru Outback, figuring we would need a smaller vehicle once we arrived at Craig's place for day trips and grocery runs. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. We stopped at a campground near Omaha the first night, grilled burgers on our little portable stove, and watched the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. Patty fell asleep reading her mystery novel while I stayed up listening to the crickets, and feeling genuinely happy for the first time in months. I remember thinking that this was exactly what retirement was supposed to feel like. I had no idea that within 72 hours, everything would shatter into something I still cannot fully explain. By the 3rd day, we had crossed into Colorado and were making our way through some of the most isolated stretches of highway I had ever seen. The landscape shifted from flat farmland to rugged hills, dotted with scrub brush and red rock formations. Cell service became spotty around noon, and by 2 in the afternoon, we had no signal at all. Patty kept checking her phone, wanting to send pictures to Craig, but eventually she gave up and just started taking photos to send later. We stopped for gas at a small station outside a town called Elwood Springs, population maybe 300 according to the faded sign. The station was one of those old-fashioned places with just 2 pumps and a little convenience store attached. A man came out to help us, which surprised me since I had not seen full-service gas in years. He was tall and wiry, maybe in his 50s, with deep lines carved into his face from sun exposure, and a faded denim jacket despite the warmth. His name tag said Roy, and he smiled at us in a way that seemed friendly enough, though his eyes lingered on our camper and the Subaru behind it a little too long. Roy asked where we were headed, and I told him Arizona to see family. He nodded slowly, wiping his hands on a rag that looked like it had never been clean. He mentioned that the route we were taking, Highway 84 through the Canyon Pass, had been having some trouble lately. When I asked what kind of trouble, he just shrugged and said folks had been reporting car problems out there, breakdowns in spots where tow trucks took hours to arrive. He suggested we take the longer route through Millbrook instead, adding maybe 2 hours to our trip but keeping us on busier roads. Patty and I exchanged a look. We had planned this route specifically because of the scenic views through the canyon, and 2 extra hours meant arriving at Craig's place well after dark. I thanked Roy for the advice but told him we would stick to our original plan. He did not argue, just handed me my receipt and said to be careful out there. As we pulled away, I saw him in my side mirror, still standing by the pumps, watching us until we disappeared around the bend. Patty mentioned that he seemed nice, just a little odd. I agreed, though something about the encounter sat uneasy in my chest, a feeling I pushed aside because I did not want to ruin the mood of our trip. Highway 84 wound through the canyon like a gray ribbon draped over ancient bones. The rock walls rose on either side of us, striped with layers of orange and brown and deep purple, where the shadows pooled. Patty had her window down, snapping pictures every few minutes, marveling at formations that looked like castles, or sleeping giants depending on how the light hit them. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual as we navigated the curves. We had not seen another car in over an hour. The camper handled well enough, but towing the Subaru made everything feel heavier, more sluggish. Around 4 in the afternoon, I noticed a white pickup truck appear in my rearview mirror. It stayed far back at first, just a speck against the canyon walls, but over the next 20 minutes it gradually closed the distance until it was maybe 50 yards behind us. I could not see the driver clearly through the glare on their windshield, just a dark shape behind the wheel. Patty noticed me checking the mirror and turned around to look. She said it was probably just someone else heading through the canyon, nothing to worry about. I nodded, but I kept watching. The pickup stayed behind us for another 30 minutes, never passing even when the road widened enough to allow it. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I sped up slightly, it matched my pace exactly. Patty stopped taking pictures and started watching the truck too, her earlier cheerfulness fading into something more guarded. I suggested we pull over at the next scenic overlook and let them pass just to ease my mind. She agreed quietly. About 10 minutes later, we reached a small gravel pullout with a wooden sign marking it as Canyon Ridge Viewpoint. I eased the camper off the road and came to a stop, expecting the white pickup to cruise past us and disappear around the next bend. Instead, it slowed down as it approached, almost to a crawl, and I got my first clear look at the driver. He was a younger man, maybe mid-30s, with a shaved head and a thick beard that covered most of his face. He wore dark sunglasses even though the sun was already dipping behind the canyon walls. He stared directly at us as he passed, his head turning to follow our position, and I saw his lips move like he was saying something or maybe counting. Then he accelerated and vanished around the curve ahead. Patty grabbed my arm and asked if I saw that, if I saw the way he looked at us. I told her yes, I saw it. We sat there in silence for a long moment, the engine idling, the wind whistling through the canyon like a low moan. I wanted to turn around. I told Patty we should head back to Elwood Springs, find a place to stay for the night, and take the alternate route in the morning. But she pointed out that we had already driven over an hour into the canyon, and going back would mean losing most of the daylight we had left. The map showed a small town called Hadley about 45 minutes ahead, and she suggested we push through, get to Hadley, and stop there instead. It made sense logically, and I told myself the man in the pickup was probably just some local who was curious about out-of-state plates. People in isolated areas noticed strangers. It did not have to mean anything sinister. So I put the camper back in drive and pulled onto the highway, checking my mirrors constantly, scanning the road ahead for any sign of that white truck. For the next 20 minutes, the drive was uneventful. The canyon walls began to shrink as we climbed higher, and patches of pine forest started appearing on the slopes. Patty relaxed a little, commenting on how pretty the trees looked in the golden afternoon light. I let myself breathe again. Maybe we had overreacted. Maybe the guy was just odd, nothing more. Then we came around a sharp bend and I had to slam the brakes so hard that Patty lurched forward against her seatbelt, and our coffee thermos flew off the dashboard onto the floor. The white pickup was parked sideways across the road, blocking both lanes completely. The driver was standing in front of it, arms crossed over his chest, watching us approach. He had taken off his sunglasses, and even from 50 feet away I could see his eyes were pale, almost colorless, like dirty ice. Behind him, 2 other men emerged from the tree line on the right side of the road. One was short and stocky, wearing a camouflage jacket and carrying something in his right hand that I could not identify at first. The other was taller, thinner, with long greasy hair pulled back in a ponytail and a cigarette hanging from his lip. They walked slowly toward the pickup, flanking the bald man. and all three of them stared at our camper with expressions that held no friendliness, no curiosity, only a kind of flat anticipation. Patty whispered my name, her voice tight and thin. I threw the camper into reverse, my foot already pressing the gas pedal. But before I could move more than a few feet, I heard the sound of another engine behind us. I looked in my side mirror and saw a rusted brown sedan pulling up to block our retreat, stopping about 20 yards back. A fourth man stepped out, older than the others, with gray stubble and a hunting rifle resting casually against his shoulder. We were boxed in completely, trapped in a stretch of canyon road with rock walls on one side, thick forest on the other, and men who clearly had been waiting for us to arrive. Patty begged me to do something, anything, but my mind went blank with a kind of terror I had never experienced before. 41 years of marriage, 2 kids raised, a whole life built on routine and predictability, and none of it had prepared me for this moment. The bald man started walking toward us, his boots crunching on the gravel, and he motioned for me to roll down my window. I did not move. He stopped about 10 feet from my door and tilted his head like he was studying an animal in a cage. Then he spoke, his voice calm and almost friendly, telling me that we could do this the easy way or the hard way, and that the easy way meant stepping out of the vehicle with our hands visible and cooperating. He said they were not going to hurt us if we behaved, that they just wanted the camper and whatever cash we had, and then they would let us walk to Hadley on foot. I wanted to believe him. Part of me was desperate to believe that this was just a robbery, that we would lose our belongings but keep our lives. But I looked at the other men, at their faces, at the way the stocky one kept tapping whatever was in his hand against his thigh, and I knew in my gut that they had no intention of letting us walk anywhere. Patty knew it too. She reached over and squeezed my hand so hard I felt her rings dig into my skin. I made a decision in that moment that still haunts me. I told Patty to hold on, and then I floored the gas pedal in reverse, aiming straight for the brown sedan behind us. The older man dove out of the way, dropping his rifle, and I heard the sickening crunch of metal as the Subaru we were towing slammed into the sedan's front end. The impact jolted us hard, and I heard glass shatter somewhere behind me, but the sedan spun sideways just enough to create a gap on the left side of the road. I threw the camper into drive and cranked the wheel, tires screaming against the asphalt as I tried to squeeze through. The bald man lunged at my window, his fist connecting with the glass and leaving a spiderweb crack across my line of sight. The stocky one ran alongside us, and I finally saw what he was carrying, a crowbar which he swung at the camper's side panel with a sound like a thunderclap. But we were moving, gaining speed, and I kept my foot pressed to the floor even as the camper rocked and shuddered from the damage. In my mirror, I saw the men scrambling back to their vehicles, and I knew we had only bought ourselves minutes at most. Patty was crying, asking if I was okay, asking what we were going to do, and I had no answers for her. All I could do was drive. The camper was struggling. Whatever damage the collision had caused, I could feel it in the way the steering pulled hard to the right, and the engine made a grinding noise that had not been there before. The Subaru behind us was dragging badly, one of its front tires blown out and scraping against the pavement in a shower of sparks. I knew we could not keep going like this for long. Patty checked her phone again, praying for a signal, but there was nothing. The road climbed higher, twisting through dense pine forest now, the canyon walls long behind us. I checked my mirrors every few seconds, expecting to see headlights, but the road behind us stayed dark. Maybe we had disabled their vehicles enough to slow them down. Maybe they had given up. I did not believe either possibility, but I let myself hope. About 15 minutes later, the camper started shuddering violently, and a horrible burning smell filled the cab. Patty pointed at the temperature gauge, which had climbed all the way into the red. The radiator must have been damaged in the collision. I had no choice but to pull over before the engine seized completely. I found a dirt road that branched off the highway, partially hidden by overgrown brush, and I turned onto it, driving about a quarter mile until we were out of sight from the main road. Then I killed the engine and we sat there in the sudden silence, listening to the ticking of hot metal. and the distant sound of wind moving through the trees. I told Patty we needed to abandon the camper. On foot, in the dark, we might have a chance of hiding until morning, and then we could find our way to Hadley or flag down a passing car. She did not argue. We grabbed what we could carry quickly: water bottles, a flashlight, her phone even though it was useless, my wallet with our cash and cards. I thought about the Subaru, but one look at its mangled front end told me it was not going anywhere. As we climbed out of the camper, the forest around us felt enormous and alive, every rustle of leaves making my heart pound. We started walking deeper into the woods, away from the dirt road, trying to move quietly through the underbrush. Patty held my hand so tight I could feel her pulse racing against my palm. We walked for maybe 20 minutes, stumbling over roots and rocks in the fading light, until we found a small ravine with a rocky overhang that offered some concealment. We crawled underneath and pressed ourselves against the cold stone, barely breathing, waiting. The darkness came fast, swallowing the forest in shades of black and gray. And then, from somewhere back toward the highway, I heard the sound of engines. More than one. They had found us, or at least found where we had turned off. Patty buried her face against my shoulder to muffle any sound, and I wrapped my arms around her, feeling her whole body tremble. Headlights flickered through the trees in the distance, sweeping back and forth like searchlights, and I heard men's voices calling out to each other, though I could not make out the words. We stayed under that overhang for hours. I do not know exactly how long because time stopped making sense in the darkness. At some point, the voices faded and the headlights disappeared, but neither of us dared to move. Patty fell into a kind of fitful half-sleep against my chest, whimpering softly every few minutes, and I stayed awake watching the shadows for any sign of movement. My legs cramped. My back ached from pressing against the stone. Mosquitoes found us and bit every inch of exposed skin, but I did not swat at them because even that small motion seemed too risky. Around what I guessed was 3 or 4 in the morning, I saw an orange glow rising above the tree line in the direction where we had left the camper. It flickered and grew brighter, and soon I could smell smoke drifting through the forest. They were burning it, destroying any evidence of what they had tried to do, or maybe just taking out their anger on our belongings since they could not find us. I held Patty tighter and watched the glow pulse against the sky until it finally began to fade with the first gray light of dawn. When the sun came up enough to see clearly, we crawled out from our hiding spot, stiff and exhausted and covered in dirt and bug bites. We started walking east, toward where I thought the highway should be, moving slowly and stopping every few minutes to listen for any sounds of pursuit. It took us almost 4 hours to reach a paved road, and another hour of walking along its shoulder before a truck driver spotted us and pulled over. His name was Glenn Barker, and he was hauling lumber down to Phoenix. He took one look at us, dirty and scratched up and clearly terrified, and told us to get in without asking any questions. He drove us straight to the sheriff's station in Hadley, and from there everything became a blur of statements and interviews and phone calls to Craig, who drove through the night to be with us. The police found our camper 2 days later, burned down to the frame in the spot where we had abandoned it. The Subaru was discovered about 6 miles away, stripped of its plates and anything valuable, left on the side of a logging road. They arrested a man named Wesley Grubb 3 weeks later, the bald one with the pale eyes, after he tried to pull the same scheme on another couple passing through. He had a record going back 20 years, armed robbery, assault, vehicle theft, and he was linked to at least 2 other disappearances in that region where the victims were never found. The other men scattered and were never identified, at least not that the police ever told us. Wesley never confessed to anything, never explained what they had planned to do with us if we had cooperated that day on the canyon road. I think about it sometimes, late at night when Patty is asleep beside me and the house is quiet. I think about what would have happened if I had not slammed that gas pedal in reverse, if I had believed his lie about letting us walk to Hadley. We would be 2 more names on a list of people who vanished on a lonely stretch of highway, and our son would have spent the rest of his life wondering what happened to his parents. We never took another road trip after that. The Winnebago was gone, and neither of us had any desire to replace it. Some roads are not meant to be traveled, and some memories cannot be left behind no matter how far you drive. Around 2 in the morning, my buddy Grant and I were about 6 hours into what was supposed to be a 12-hour drive from Denver to Kansas City. We had left after his shift ended at the warehouse, figuring we could split the driving and make it by noon the next day. Neither of us had slept much the night before, him because of work, me because my mind was racing about seeing my dad in the hospital. Grant was behind the wheel when he started drifting, just slightly, toward the shoulder. I told him to pull over before he killed us both. We had passed the last real rest stop maybe 40 miles back, but there was this little turnoff coming up on the right side of the highway. No sign, no lights, just a gravel patch carved into the trees. Grant pulled in and parked near the edge where the gravel met the grass. The plan was simple: sleep for 2 or 3 hours, then keep moving. We both got out to stretch. The air was cold for September. That kind of cold that sneaks into your jacket and sits against your skin. Grant walked toward the tree line to take a leak while I paced around the car, trying to shake off the stiffness in my legs from sitting for so long. Our headlights were still on, cutting 2 pale beams into the darkness ahead. That was when I noticed the ground. Right there, maybe 20 feet in front of our car, the gravel was torn up. Fresh tire marks, deep ones, like someone had peeled out in a hurry. The soil next to them was disturbed too, pushed around in uneven mounds. I remember thinking it looked wrong, like someone had been digging or dragging something heavy. I called out to Grant, told him to come look at this. He zipped up and walked over, and we both just stood there staring at the ground, trying to make sense of it. Grant pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam was weak, but it was enough to see more than we wanted to. The tire marks were fresh. I mean, really fresh. The edges of the grooves were still sharp, not worn down by wind or rain. Whoever made them had been here within the last hour, maybe less. We followed the tracks with the light, and they curved hard toward the tree line before disappearing into the grass. That was when I caught the smell. It was faint at first, kind of sweet and chemical, like gasoline mixed with something else I could not identify. Grant smelled it too because he stopped moving and just stood there with his phone pointed at the ground. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. We were both thinking the same thing, but neither of us wanted to be the one to say it out loud. I took the phone from his hand and walked a few more steps toward where the smell was coming from. About 10 feet from the edge of the gravel, half hidden in the tall grass, I found a pair of gloves. They were the disposable kind, latex or nitrile, the type you see doctors wearing. One of them was inside out, like someone had ripped it off in a hurry. I crouched down to get a better look, and that was when I saw the jacket. It was maybe 5 feet further into the grass, bunched up like someone had thrown it there. Dark colored, looked like denim or maybe canvas. I moved the flashlight beam across it and my stomach turned. There was a stain on the back, a big one, dark and wet looking. I have never seen that much blood on anything in my life, not even in movies where they exaggerate everything. This was real. The fabric was soaked through in some places, and there were smears leading away from it, deeper into the brush. Drag marks. Someone had been dragged from this spot into the woods. I stood up so fast I almost lost my balance. Grant was right behind me, looking over my shoulder, and I heard him whisper something under his breath. A curse, a prayer, I do not know. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was seeing, trying to come up with some innocent explanation that would make all of this okay. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe hunters had been here and dressed a deer or something. But hunters do not wear latex gloves. Hunters do not leave behind jackets soaked in blood. And those drag marks were wide, too wide to be an animal. The grass flattened in a path that was clearly made by something human-sized being pulled through it. I turned the flashlight off and grabbed Grant by the arm. "We need to leave," I told him. "Right now." He did not argue. We both started walking back toward the car, trying not to run, trying not to make noise. Every sound seemed amplified in that darkness. Our footsteps on the gravel, our breathing, the rustle of wind through the trees. I kept expecting to hear something else, footsteps that were not ours, A voice. Something. We were maybe 15 feet from the car when Grant stopped walking. He grabbed my shoulder and squeezed hard, not saying anything, just pointing. I followed his finger toward the tree line on the opposite side of the rest area, the side we had not explored. There was a light. Faint, yellowish, barely visible through the branches. It looked like a flashlight beam, but it was not moving. Just sitting there, pointed in our direction. I could not tell how far away it was. 50 feet, maybe 100. The trees made it impossible to judge distance. We stood there frozen, staring at that light, waiting to see if it would move. It did not. But then it turned off. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, and the darkness that replaced it felt heavier somehow. Grant and I looked at each other. I could see the fear on his face even in the dim glow from our headlights. Without a word, we both broke into a run toward the car. I got to the passenger side and yanked the door open while Grant fumbled with his keys. My hands were trembling so bad, I could barely get my seatbelt on. Grant dropped the keys once, picked them up, dropped them again. I wanted to scream at him to hurry, but I could not find my voice. Finally, he got the key in the ignition and the engine turned over. He threw the car into reverse and we shot backward, gravel spraying everywhere, the tires spinning for a second before they caught. I twisted around in my seat to look out the back window, and that was when I saw the figure. A person, just standing there at the edge of the tree line where that light had been. I could not make out any features, just a shape, dark against darker, watching us leave. Grant must have seen it too in the rearview mirror because he said something I will not repeat and floored the gas pedal. We hit the highway going way too fast, the back end of the car fishtailing before he got it under control. Neither of us looked back again. We drove in silence for the first 10 minutes. I kept checking the side mirror, expecting to see headlights behind us, expecting someone to be following. The road was empty. Just us and the dotted yellow line and the black wall of trees on either side. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Grant's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched tight. I wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but every time I opened my mouth, nothing came out. What do you even say after something like that? We just found evidence of what looked like a murder or an assault or something terrible, and there was someone in those woods who saw us find it. Someone who watched us discover what they did. I kept thinking about that light turning off. Whoever was holding it made a choice in that moment. They could have stayed hidden, waited for us to leave, but they wanted us to know they were there. They wanted us to see them watching. About 30 miles down the highway, we found a gas station that was still open. One of those 24-hour places with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and a bored-looking guy behind the counter. We pulled in and just sat there for a minute, engine running, neither of us wanting to get out. Grant finally turned to me and asked what we should do. "Call the police," I said. Obviously, we have to call the police. But even as I said it, I felt this knot forming in my gut. What were we going to tell them? We found some gloves and a bloody jacket at an unmarked rest stop somewhere on the highway. We did not even know exactly where we had been. There were no signs, no mile markers that I remembered. Nothing to identify that turnoff. I pulled up maps on my phone and tried to scroll back along the route we had taken, but every stretch of that highway looked the same. Trees, road, trees, road. Grant suggested we just keep driving, get to Kansas City, forget about it. I told him we could not do that. If someone was hurt back there, if someone was dying in those woods while we sat here debating, we had to do something. I called 911 from the gas station parking lot. The dispatcher sounded tired, like she had already dealt with 100 calls that night and mine was just one more. I tried to explain what we had found. The tire marks, the smell, the gloves, the jacket with blood on it, the drag marks. She asked me for a location, and I told her I did not know exactly. Somewhere between mile marker 80 and 120 on the highway heading east from Denver. That was the best I could do. She asked if we had touched anything, and I said no, which was true. She asked if we had seen anyone, and I hesitated. I told her about the light in the trees, about the figure standing there when we drove away. There was a pause on the line. She asked me to describe the figure and I said I could not. It was too dark. I just saw a shape. She told me to stay on the line while she contacted the state patrol. Grant and I sat there in that parking lot for almost an hour, waiting for someone to call us back. When they finally did, it was a trooper who said they were sending units to check the area, but that it might take a while to locate the exact spot. We made it to Kansas City around noon the next day. I spent 3 days at the hospital with my dad, barely sleeping, jumping at every noise. Grant stayed with his cousin in the city and we texted back and forth but did not really talk about what happened. It was like we had made some unspoken agreement to pretend it was just a bad dream. On the 4th day, I got a call from a detective with the state patrol. He said they had found the rest area we described. He said they had found evidence of what he called a violent incident. He would not give me details over the phone, just asked if I would be willing to come in and give a formal statement when I got back to Denver. I said yes. When I asked him if they found anybody in the woods, he went quiet for a second. Then he said they were still investigating and could not comment on an active case. The way he said it, the weight in his voice, told me everything I needed to know. They found something in those trees, or someone. And I do not think whoever it was made it out alive. I gave my statement a week later. The detective showed me photos of the rest area in daylight and it looked so ordinary, so harmless, just a patch of gravel and grass next to the highway. He confirmed that they had recovered the jacket and gloves, that the blood was human, that they had found other evidence deeper in the woods that he could not discuss. He asked me again about the figure I saw and I told him the same thing I told the dispatcher. Just a shape, too dark to see anything else. He nodded like he expected that answer. When I asked if they had any suspects, he shook his head. No witnesses except us, and we had not seen enough to help. That was 6 months ago. I still check the news sometimes looking for any update, any arrest, anything. There has been nothing. Whoever was in those woods that night is still out there. Sometimes when I am driving at night and I see a dark turnoff on the side of the road, I feel my chest tighten, and I grip the steering wheel a little harder. I think about that light turning off. I think about that figure standing there watching us leave, knowing we had seen what they did. And I wonder if they ever think about us too. Five of us crammed into my buddy Garrett's old Chevy Suburban that Friday night in March 2024, heading from Austin to New Orleans for a bachelor party weekend. My friend Milo was getting married in 2 months, and we had rented a house in the French Quarter, pooled our money for the trip, and taken the day off work. I had just turned 26 the week before, still working as a paralegal at a small firm downtown, and this trip felt like the kind of escape I desperately needed after months of grinding through case files. Garrett drove first shift, Milo rode shotgun handling the playlist, and the rest of us, me, Owen, and Lucas, spread out in the back 2 rows with a cooler of sodas and enough snacks to survive an apocalypse. We left around 8 in the evening, figuring we would drive through the night and arrive by early morning. The energy in the car was electric. 5 guys in their mid-20s acting like teenagers again, laughing about old college stories and roasting Milo about finally settling down. We had been on the road for maybe 3 hours when we crossed into Louisiana, somewhere past the Texas border on a stretch of Interstate 10 that felt increasingly desolate. The billboards disappeared, replaced by dense walls of black trees pressing close to the highway. Traffic thinned out until we were often the only headlights visible in either direction. Garrett had the cruise control set at 72, keeping us just above the speed limit, but nothing crazy. Owen had fallen asleep against the window, and Lucas was scrolling through his phone with the brightness turned way down. Milo and I were debating whether to stop for gas at the next exit or push through another hour, when Garrett suddenly sat up straighter and squinted into the rear-view mirror. Red and blue lights had appeared behind us, flickering through the back window with an intensity that made me instinctively reach for my seatbelt to check if it was fastened. Garrett muttered something under his breath and started slowing down, pulling toward the shoulder, as the vehicle behind us followed, its lights painting the dark trees in alternating splashes of color. The first thing I noticed when we came to a complete stop was the vehicle itself. It was a dark-colored SUV, maybe black or deep navy, but it had no clear markings on the side, no sheriff's star, no state trooper emblem, no police written anywhere that I could see. The light bar on top looked almost homemade, like someone had mounted it themselves, and it sat slightly crooked on the roof. Owen woke up and asked what was going on, his voice groggy and confused. Lucas leaned forward between the front seats, trying to get a better look. We all just sat there in silence for what felt like forever, watching the figure inside the SUV through our mirrors. The driver's door finally opened, and a man stepped out. But he did not walk the way cops usually walk during a traffic stop. He moved too quickly, almost eagerly, and he approached the driver's side window without that cautious, hand-on-hip posture you see in every police procedural on television. He was carrying a flashlight, but he kept it pointed down at the ground instead of into our vehicle. Garrett rolled down his window about halfway, and the man leaned in close, closer than any officer had ever gotten during the few traffic stops I had witnessed in my life. He was wearing dark clothing, something that looked like a uniform but not quite right. The shirt was plain black with no badge, no name tag, no department patches. He had a belt with various items attached, but in the dim light I could not make out what they were. His face was gaunt, with deep-set eyes that caught the red glow from his own taillights, and he had a patchy beard that looked like it had been growing unchecked for weeks. The man smiled at Garrett, but it was the kind of smile that did not reach his eyes, the kind that made you want to look away. He asked for license and registration in a voice that was too casual, too friendly, like he was greeting an old neighbor instead of conducting an official stop. Garrett handed over his documents, and the man took them without even glancing at them, just held them loosely in his hand while he scanned the inside of our vehicle with those hollow eyes. He started asking questions, but none of them had anything to do with why he had pulled us over. He wanted to know where we were headed, which I guess was normal enough. But then he asked how long we planned to stay. He asked if anyone was expecting us, if we had told our families about the trip, if anyone knew exactly which route we were taking. Milo shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat and said we were just going to New Orleans for a weekend trip, trying to keep it vague. The man nodded slowly like he was cataloging every word. Then he pointed his flashlight directly at Lucas in the back seat and asked him specifically if he had a girlfriend waiting for him at home. Lucas stammered out a confused yes, and the man asked if she knew where he was right now, if she would notice if he did not text her tonight. The question hung in the air like something rotten. I could feel my pulse in my throat, and I exchanged a look with Owen that confirmed we were both thinking the same thing. Something was very wrong here. Garrett finally asked what this was about, what he had been pulled over for, and the man just chuckled and said he would get to that. The man stepped back from the window and walked slowly around the front of the Suburban, dragging his fingers along the hood as he went, like he was inspecting it for dust. He stopped at the passenger side and tapped on the window with one knuckle, signaling for Milo to roll it down. Milo hesitated, looking at Garrett, who gave a small nod because what else could we do? The guy had lights. He had pulled us over. We were stuck on the side of a dark highway in the middle of nowhere, Louisiana. Milo cracked the window just a few inches, and the man bent down to peer inside, his face uncomfortably close to the glass. He asked Milo to step out of the vehicle, just like that, casual as anything, like he was asking him to pass the salt. He said he needed to speak with him privately, that it was standard procedure, that it would only take a minute. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Milo asked why, asked what he had done, and the man's expression flickered. Just for a second, something cold and irritated passed across his face before the fake friendliness returned. He repeated that he needed Milo to step out, and this time his voice had an edge to it. That was when Garrett did something that probably saved us. He pulled out his phone and said he was going to call 911 just to verify the stop. Said he had heard about fake police incidents and wanted to make sure everything was legitimate. He said it calmly, almost apologetically, like he was embarrassed to be cautious. The man outside straightened up fast, and I watched his whole demeanor change in an instant. The fake smile vanished completely. His jaw tightened, and he took a step back from the vehicle, his eyes darting toward his SUV parked behind us. He told Garrett that would not be necessary, that he was wasting everyone's time, that we were free to go. Just like that. No ticket, no warning, no explanation for why he had pulled us over in the first place. He did not even hand back Garrett's license and registration. He just dropped them on the ground next to the driver's side door and started walking back to his vehicle. His pace was quick now, urgent, completely different from the slow, predatory approach he had used when he first got out. Owen whispered for Garrett to go, to just drive, and Garrett did not need to be told twice. Garrett threw the Suburban into drive and pulled back onto the highway, accelerating faster than I had ever seen him drive. Nobody said anything for at least a full minute. We just sat there in the glow of the dashboard lights, breathing hard, trying to process what had just happened. Lucas was the first to speak, asking if that guy was even a real cop, and none of us had an answer. I turned around in my seat to watch the SUV behind us, half expecting it to follow, but its lights suddenly went dark. The red and blue stopped flashing, the headlights turned off completely, and the vehicle just sat there on the shoulder like a dead thing. Then it made a U-turn across the median, which no police officer would ever do, and disappeared in the opposite direction without any lights on at all. We watched until it vanished into the darkness, and then we all started talking at once, our voices overlapping with fear and confusion and adrenaline. Milo kept saying he had almost gotten out of the car, that he had actually reached for the door handle before the man's questions got too strange. That thought made me feel sick in a way I cannot fully describe. We drove for another 40 minutes without stopping, checking the mirrors constantly, jumping at every pair of headlights that appeared behind us. Garrett kept his speed exactly at the limit, terrified of getting pulled over again, but also terrified of staying in that stretch of highway any longer than necessary. When we finally saw a well-lit gas station near the next exit, we pulled in without even discussing it. The fluorescent lights felt like a sanctuary after all that darkness. We parked close to the entrance where other cars were filling up, where there were cameras and people, and the ordinary sounds of a convenience store operating in the middle of the night. I got out on shaky legs and just stood there for a moment, breathing in the smell of gasoline and fried food from inside, grounding myself in something normal. That was when we noticed a Louisiana State Trooper vehicle parked on the other side of the lot, a real one with proper markings and a uniformed officer sitting inside doing paperwork. Owen suggested we go talk to him, tell him what happened, and after a brief debate we all agreed. We needed to know if what we had experienced was as wrong as it felt. The trooper's name was printed on a tag pinned to his chest, and he looked up from his clipboard with the kind of tired patience that comes from working night shifts for years. We must have looked rattled because he immediately asked if we were all right, if there had been an accident. Garrett explained what happened, the SUV with no markings, the crooked light bar, the man in plain black clothes asking invasive questions, the attempt to separate Milo from the group. The trooper's expression changed as Garrett talked. He went from politely attentive to genuinely concerned, leaning forward in his seat and asking us to describe the vehicle again, to describe the man, to pinpoint exactly where on the interstate this had occurred. When Garrett finished, the trooper was quiet for a moment. Then he told us something that made my stomach turn to ice. He said there was no authorized unit operating in that area tonight. No sheriff's deputies, no state troopers, no federal vehicles. He said we needed to file an official report immediately, and his voice had a gravity to it that told me this was not the first time he had heard a story like ours. We spent the next 2 hours at a state police station off the highway, giving statements and descriptions to a detective who recorded everything on a digital device. She asked us to recall every detail we could, the shape of the light bar, the exact wording of the questions, the way the man had moved, anything distinctive about his appearance or his vehicle. Lucas remembered that the SUV had a small dent on the front bumper, driver's side. Owen recalled that the man had been wearing boots that looked military, not the polished shoes a real officer would wear. I remembered his hands, how his fingernails were long and dirty, how he had a faded tattoo on his left wrist that looked like numbers or letters, but I could not make it out in the dark. The detective wrote everything down without expression, but when we finished, she thanked us in a way that felt heavy, significant. She said our description matched 2 other reports from the past 18 months, incidents on the same stretch of highway, involving a similar vehicle and a man fitting the same general appearance. She did not tell us what happened in those other cases, and I did not ask. I was too afraid of the answer. We made it to New Orleans by sunrise, but the bachelor party felt hollow after that. We went through the motions, the dinners, the bars, the laughter that came too loud and faded too quickly. But none of us could shake what had happened on that dark stretch of Interstate 10. Milo kept coming back to the moment he almost opened the door, kept saying he could feel the handle under his fingers, kept wondering what would have happened if he had stepped out into the night with that man. We never found out who he was. The detective called Garrett a few weeks later to say they were still investigating, that they had increased patrols in that area, but no arrest was ever made as far as I know. Sometimes I search online for news stories about that highway, about missing persons or attacks on travelers in rural Louisiana, and I find enough to keep me awake at night. I think about how easily we could have become one of those stories. I think about how the only thing that saved us was Garrett's instinct to reach for his phone. And I think about that man, still out there somewhere, waiting on a dark shoulder with his crooked lights flashing, hoping the next group of travelers will be a little less cautious than we were. That morning marked the 3rd stretch of our drive across a wide, quiet part of the country, where towns felt more like suggestions than places. The trip was meant to reset things for us, a low-budget escape after months of stress, juggling work deadlines and school schedules. We were tired of chain hotels and figured a small roadside lodge would give us a story to laugh about later. The listing promised clean rooms, hot showers, and old-fashioned quiet, which sounded perfect after hours of engine noise. My partner Sarah was scrolling reviews while I drove, and none of them raised obvious alarms. The kids were restless but excited, counting down miles like it was a game. When the GPS told us to turn onto a narrow gravel road, I remember thinking how empty everything looked. Fields stretched out on both sides, and the silence pressed in the moment we slowed down. The lodge came into view like something paused in time, sitting back from the road with faded signage, and windows dulled by grime, paint peeled in long strips, and weeds pushed through cracks in the parking lot as if no one bothered fighting them anymore. No cars were parked outside, not even near the entrance, which felt strange for mid-afternoon. A single figure stepped out from the office door, a man with a stiff posture and clothes that looked slept in rather than worn. He spoke politely but didn't offer small talk, keeping his answers short and his eyes drifting past us instead of meeting them. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something sour I couldn't place. Inside the office, half the lights were off, and a dusty fan hummed without moving much air. We exchanged a glance, the kind that says you're noticing the same thing but don't want to scare the kids yet. The room itself was functional but unsettling, like it had been cleaned just enough to pass a glance. The curtains were heavy and blocked most of the daylight, making the space feel smaller than it was. While unpacking, I noticed a thudding noise coming from somewhere behind the building, irregular and low, as if something heavy was being shifted around. Sarah tried opening a side exit near the vending machines, only to find it locked from the outside, which didn't make sense for a guest area. Another door near the back stairwell was blocked the same way. When I stepped out to get fresh air, I caught sight of items tucked behind a dumpster. A worn backpack, a single sneaker, and a phone case cracked down the middle. They weren't trash, not arranged like garbage, but hidden, pushed out of sight. The noise started again, closer this time, and the skin along my arms prickled despite the heat. We didn't announce our decision, but it happened all at once. Sarah quietly told the kids to put their shoes back on and grab their bags without asking questions. I walked to the office to return the key, and the man looked surprised, almost annoyed when I said we were leaving early. He didn't ask why, Just took the key and slid it into a drawer, already full of them. Back outside, the sky was beginning to shift toward evening, shadows stretching longer across the empty lot. As we drove away, I checked the mirror more than necessary, half expecting headlights to appear behind us. None did. But the sense of relief didn't hit until the lodge disappeared from view. We never reported the place, mostly because we didn't know what to say without sounding paranoid. Even now, I think about those hidden belongings and wonder who they belonged to, and whether leaving before nightfall was the only reason we got back on the road safely. We kept driving until the road finally led us to a stretch with actual traffic, the kind where headlights pass often enough to remind you other people exist. No one spoke for a while, not even the kids, which told me more than questions ever could. The radio played softly, some talk show fading in and out as hills interrupted the signal. Every now and then, Sarah would glance at me like she wanted to say something, then stop herself. My thoughts kept circling back to the locked exits, the way they weren't jammed or broken but deliberately secured. That detail stuck with me more than the noise or the empty lot. It suggested planning, not neglect. By the time the sun dipped lower, the tension inside the car felt heavier than the luggage in the trunk. We pulled into a small gas station just before dusk, the kind with buzzing lights and a single cashier behind thick glass. While filling up, I noticed my hands still weren't steady, even though we were clearly out in the open. Sarah took the kids inside to use the restroom, and I stayed by the pump, scanning the lot out of habit. A family minivan rolled in, then a pickup truck, and the normalcy of it all felt almost unreal. Inside, Sarah mentioned that one of the kids had asked why the doors at the lodge were locked, and she'd brushed it off as an old building issue. The lie sounded thin even to her own ears. We agreed not to stop anywhere isolated again that day, no matter how tired we got. As night settled in, the image of those items behind the building kept replaying in my head. They weren't weathered enough to have been there long, and they didn't belong together, which made it worse. I thought about going back earlier, convincing myself we were overreacting, but the idea of returning after dark made my chest tighten. At one point, Sarah suggested calling a non-emergency line just to report the locked exits and the abandoned feel of the place. We talked it through and realized we had no concrete proof of anything, just instincts and fragments. Still, instincts exist for a reason, and ignoring them had never ended well for anyone I knew. We decided that if we saw the lodge listed again during the trip, we'd leave a warning review without accusations, just facts. We reached a busier town late that evening and checked into a chain hotel that smelled like bleach and coffee. The relief was immediate and almost embarrassing, like we'd escaped something without knowing exactly what it was. The kids finally relaxed, laughing at the TV while eating snacks from a vending machine that actually worked. Sarah and I stayed up longer than usual, replaying the day in quiet voices, making sure our memories matched. Nothing else happened that night. No calls, no strange encounters. Just sleep that came hard but stayed. Even now, years later, I can't explain what that lodge was really used for. All I know is that leaving when we did felt like a decision that closed a door we were never meant to open. The next morning, the drive resumed under a pale sky, and the previous day felt unreal in a way that made details sharpen instead of fade. Every time we passed a turnoff toward open land, I felt a small spike of tension, like my body remembered something my mind wanted to shelve. The kids asked if we could ever go back to a place like that lodge, curious in the way only they can be, and Sarah answered quickly that some places just aren't meant for families. I replayed the man's expression when we returned the key, the way he didn't bother pretending to care. It wasn't hostility exactly, more like impatience, as if we'd interrupted a routine he expected to continue. That stuck with me more than the noise ever did. Routine implies repetition, and repetition implies others. A few days later, once we were back home and the trip had officially ended, I tried to look the lodge up again. The listing was still there, photos unchanged, descriptions still cheerful and vague. I scrolled through recent reviews and noticed something unsettling. Gaps. Weeks with nothing. then a sudden short, overly positive comment that read like it was written to fill space rather than describe a stay. I wrote a careful review of our own, sticking to what we experienced without speculation. I mentioned the lack of guests, the locked exits, and the belongings behind the building, choosing words that couldn't be brushed off as dramatic. Hitting post felt heavier than it should have, like tossing a note into deep water and hoping someone else would find it. Not long after that, the listing disappeared entirely. No explanation, no archived page, just gone. Sarah noticed it first and called me over, and we stared at the screen longer than necessary. I checked other booking sites, different spellings, even the map location itself. The place still existed on satellite view, but no accommodation information came up anymore. That was the closest thing to an answer we ever got, and it didn't feel comforting. If anything, it confirmed that something about that lodge didn't survive attention. We talked briefly about contacting authorities again, but with no listing and no new information, it felt like chasing a shadow. Life moved on, as it always does, but that day still surfaces in quiet moments. Sometimes it's triggered by a roadside sign advertising cheap rooms, or by a stretch of road where the silence feels too intentional. I don't tell this story to scare people away from travel or small towns. I share it because sometimes the safest decision doesn't come with proof or validation, just a strong internal warning. We trusted that warning and left while the sun was still up. Whatever happened at that lodge after dark, or before we arrived, remains unknown to us. And honestly, not knowing feels like the best possible outcome. That stretch of road sits in my memory like a long breath I never finished exhaling. I was on a road trip with my friend Logan, heading across the state to clear my head after a messy few months at work. At the time, my life felt paused, like I was drifting between decisions, filling days with movement just to avoid sitting still. We weren't rushing anywhere, just driving, talking, stopping for gas when the tank dipped too low. The highway thinned out as the afternoon went on, the scenery flattening into fields and distant tree lines. Radio stations faded one by one until static filled the car. It felt normal in that rural, middle-of-nowhere way you don't question until later. Looking back, the quiet should have registered as a warning, but it didn't. The car gave out without drama, a sudden loss of power followed by a gentle roll onto the shoulder. Logan tried the ignition a few times while I popped the hood, even though I know nothing about engines. The air smelled hot and dry, and the wind carried dust from the road into my mouth. My phone showed no service, not even a flicker of signal. Logan checked his too, then laughed it off, saying it was kind of nice to be unreachable. We decided to wait, figuring someone would pass eventually. Cars were rare out there, which made each one feel louder and more noticeable. That's when the pickup appeared for the first time. It came from behind us, dark-colored and older, with a rattling sound that lingered after it passed. The driver slowed just enough to look, his head turning toward us before the truck picked up speed again. A few minutes later, the same pickup came back from the opposite direction, slowing even more this time. Logan joked that the guy must be lost, but his voice didn't sound convinced. The third pass was slower than the second, the tires crunching on gravel near the shoulder. I noticed how the truck stayed aligned with us longer than necessary. When it finally pulled ahead, the quiet afterward felt heavier than before. We stopped joking then. The pickup returned again and didn't pass this time. It pulled over a short distance ahead of us, hazard lights blinking in an uneven rhythm. The driver stepped out slowly, wearing a ball cap pulled low and boots that looked too clean for roadside work. He asked if we needed help, his voice calm but oddly flat, like he was reading lines he'd practiced. Logan thanked him and said we had someone coming, even though that wasn't true. The man lingered, offering tools, a ride, anything that would get us into his truck. His eyes kept moving between us and our car, never settling long enough to feel normal. When we refused again, his expression hardened just a little before he nodded and walked back to his pickup. We waited until the sound of his engine disappeared before either of us spoke. We sat in the car with the doors locked, the windows cracked just enough to let air in, Time stretched in a strange way out there, every minute feeling both slow and rushed. I kept checking the road in both directions, expecting the pickup to reappear at any second. Logan tried to keep things light, talking about food we'd get once we reached civilization again, but he kept glancing at the rearview mirror. Another vehicle eventually passed, a sedan that didn't slow down at all, and for a moment that felt worse than being noticed. The sun started sinking lower, pulling long shadows across the asphalt. I realized how exposed we were. Two people stranded with nowhere to go if someone decided to stop again. The pickup came back just as the light began to soften into early evening. This time it slowed even more, almost crawling past us before stopping several car lengths behind. The driver didn't get out right away. He sat there with the engine running, window halfway down, watching us through the side mirror. Logan whispered that we should stay put and not react. When the man finally stepped out, he didn't smile or speak at first. He walked closer than before, close enough that I could smell oil and cigarettes on his clothes. He repeated the offer to help, his tone sharper now, less friendly. We told him again that we were fine, that assistance was on the way. He stared at us for a long second too long, then returned to his truck without another word, and drove off fast enough to kick dust into the air. After that, neither of us talked much. The silence felt intentional, like speaking might invite attention back to us. Eventually, a roadside service truck appeared from the opposite direction, its lights flashing in a way that felt unreal with relief. The driver was all business, hooking up the car and asking quick questions while I kept scanning the highway. I half expected the pickup to roar back into view before we left. As we pulled away, I looked back at the stretch of road shrinking behind us, trying to memorize every detail in case it mattered later. Logan let out a long breath and said he hadn't realized how tense he'd been until that moment. We ended up at a small town not far from there, waiting in a diner while the car was looked at. The place smelled like grease and burnt coffee, comforting in its familiarity. While Logan talked to the mechanic, I scrolled through local news on the diner's weak Wi-Fi. That's when I saw it, a short article buried near the bottom of the page. It mentioned a string of recent roadside robberies along a nearby highway, all involving stranded drivers and a dark pickup that would circle back before the attacks. The descriptions matched too closely to ignore. I read it twice, then a third time, my chest tightening with each detail. I showed the article to Logan and the color drained from his face as he read. The robberies hadn't happened far from where we broke down, and the pattern was almost identical. Victims had accepted help or rides thinking they had no other option. The article didn't say whether anyone had been caught. We paid our bill and left without finishing our food, both of us quiet during the rest of the drive. Even now, I think about how easily things could have gone differently if we'd made one small choice. That day taught me how thin the line is between an inconvenience and something much worse, especially when you're alone on the road. The rest of the drive felt longer than the miles on the map. Every pickup truck we passed made my shoulders tense, even hours later when the scenery changed and traffic picked up. We didn't play music. We didn't talk about what almost happened. It was like acknowledging it might give it more weight than we were ready to carry. When we finally reached our destination, exhaustion hit all at once, the kind that comes from being alert for too long. That night I kept replaying the man's pauses, the way he lingered, the fact that he'd come back more than once. None of it screamed danger on its own, but together it formed something unmistakable. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop checking news updates from that area. A few more reports surfaced, then nothing. No arrest, no closure. Logan and I talked about it once more, sitting in silence afterward, both of us knowing how close we'd come without ever agreeing on the details. He admitted he'd considered getting into the truck just to end the waiting. That scared me more than the stranger ever did. It made me realize how vulnerability changes your judgment, how exhaustion and isolation can make bad ideas feel reasonable. I started carrying extra water, a paper map, and a roadside kit after that trip. Not because I thought preparation would make me fearless, but because I never wanted to feel that powerless again. Sometimes I still picture that highway, how wide and empty it was, How easy it would have been for something terrible to unfold without witnesses. The scariest part wasn't the man or the truck, but how ordinary it all felt while it was happening. No dramatic moment, no clear signal, just a slow, tightening sense that something wasn't right. To this day, I don't know what the driver intended or how many people didn't get as lucky as we did. Maybe he was involved, maybe he wasn't. All I know is that we left that road intact because we trusted our instincts and stayed put, even when waiting felt unbearable. That experience changed how I see quiet places and helpful strangers. Some stretches of road don't forgive small mistakes, and some warnings don't come with sirens or signs. They come as repetition, patience, and the feeling that someone is watching a little too closely. Early that morning, the trip still felt simple and almost boring, the kind of drive meant to clear your head. The plan was to cross a few states in one stretch, just me, Mason, and Riley rotating the wheel, chasing that loose feeling you get when the road keeps unspooling ahead of you. Life at that point was steady but numb, long work weeks, cheap takeout, and the sense that every day looked the same. A road trip felt like pressing pause, even if only for a weekend. The car smelled like gas station coffee and the citrus wipes Riley kept using on the dashboard. We joked about playlists, missed exits, and how the GPS always sounded annoyed. Nothing about the day hinted that it would stay with me this long. By late afternoon, the highway thinned out, traffic dissolving into long gaps of silence between passing cars. The GPS rerouted us without warning, insisting we take a narrow exit that cut through farmland instead of staying straight. At first, it felt harmless, rolling hills, endless fences, and fields that looked abandoned rather than worked. Cell service faded bar by bar until the screen showed nothing but the map and our blinking dot. Mason tapped the phone like that would fix it, laughing it off, but the laugh didn't last long. The road narrowed, asphalt cracking into uneven patches, and the sky started turning a heavy gray. We passed no houses, no stores, just mailboxes leaning at odd angles. Eventually, we reached a small cluster of buildings that barely qualified as a town. A gas pump with peeling paint, a diner with one flickering light, and a handful of trucks parked like they'd been there forever. We pulled in, relieved to see people at all. Inside the diner, the air smelled like old grease and burnt coffee, and conversations died the second we walked in. The locals stared openly, not curious, just watchful. I asked an older man behind the counter how to get back to the highway, keeping my tone friendly. He didn't answer right away, just looked past me toward the window, then muttered something about taking the long way around. Another woman shook her head, whispering that the roads weren't safe after dark without explaining why. When we stepped back outside, the sun was already sinking, shadows stretching too fast across the dirt lot. Mason pointed out that one of the trucks had started its engine as we left, the sound low and deliberate. As we drove away, another set of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, then another farther back. No one passed us, no one honked. They just stayed there, matching our speed. Riley tried the GPS again, but the screen stayed frozen, useless. The silence inside the car felt heavier than the night settling around us. That was the moment the trip stopped feeling like an escape and started feeling like a mistake. The farther we drove, the more deliberate it felt, like the road itself was closing in. The pavement thinned into gravel in places, tires crunching louder than they should have. The vehicles behind us multiplied until I counted 3 sets of headlights, spaced evenly, never drifting. Mason kept glancing at the mirrors, jaw tight, saying they were probably locals heading home, but his voice didn't match the words. Riley suggested turning around, but the idea of going back past that diner made my chest tighten. There were no streetlights, just our headlights carving a narrow tunnel through the dark. Every farmhouse we passed sat far back from the road, windows black, as if no one lived there at all. We slowed near a fork in the road, unsure which way to go, and that's when one of the vehicles behind us flashed its high beams, sharp and sudden. Another did the same a second later, like a signal. Mason accelerated, dust kicking up behind us. and the headlights closed the distance almost immediately. One truck pulled alongside us just long enough for me to see a silhouette leaning toward the window, arm resting out the side, before dropping back again. No one tried to pass. They didn't need to. They seemed content keeping us where we were. My thoughts kept circling the same question. Why not just let us leave? Riley spotted a faded sign half buried in weeds pointing toward the highway, or what we hoped was the highway. Mason took the turn without slowing, the car jolting as we hit a rougher stretch of road. The vehicles behind us hesitated for the first time, engines roaring louder as they adjusted. One peeled off, disappearing down a side road, but two stayed with us. The road climbed a small hill, then dipped sharply, trees closing in on both sides. For a moment, the headlights vanished behind a curve, and the silence felt unreal, like holding your breath underwater. That relief shattered when the headlights reappeared closer than before. Mason pushed the car harder than he ever had, the engine whining in protest. The road straightened, and ahead, faint but unmistakable, were the reflective markers of the highway. As soon as our tires hit smooth asphalt, the vehicles slowed, then stopped altogether, their headlights cutting off one by one. We didn't slow down. We didn't look back. The rest of the drive passed in a haze of adrenaline and disbelief, each of us replaying the same images in our heads, trying to make sense of something that refused to feel random. Once we stopped at a rest area, none of us got out of the car right away. The lights buzzed overhead, bright and sterile, and it felt wrong that other travelers moved around like nothing had happened. Mason finally killed the engine and just sat there, hands on the wheel, breathing slowly like he was trying not to shake. Riley broke the silence by saying the whole thing sounded insane out loud, which somehow made it worse. We replayed every second, the looks in that diner, the way the trucks moved in sync, the silence when we asked simple questions. No one had a theory that made sense. We agreed on one thing only. That wasn't random. Later that night, at a motel we hadn't planned on stopping at, sleep didn't come easily. Every headlight passing outside the curtains made me tense up, listening for engines slowing down. I started searching online, not knowing exactly what I was looking for, just typing fragments of what we experienced. Buried in local forums and old news posts were mentions of stranded motorists, assaults that never led anywhere, people found injured on back roads with no memory of who helped or hurt them. The locations were vague, unnamed, but the details lined up in uncomfortable ways. The comments were worse than the articles, locals warning outsiders not to wander, not to trust detours. Seeing it written by strangers made my skin prickle. The next morning we decided not to report anything. That choice still bothers me, but at the time, we couldn't explain what happened without sounding unhinged. No plates, no faces, no clear crime, just fear and instinct. Instead, Mason altered the rest of the route manually, triple-checking every stop. Riley barely joked anymore, staring out the window like the landscape itself might turn on us. We stayed on major highways, ignored every suggested shortcut, and didn't stop unless there were crowds around. The trip ended early, not because of distance, but because none of us wanted to keep pretending this was still fun. What sticks with me isn't just the fear, but how coordinated it all felt. Those people didn't panic or rush. They controlled the pace, the silence, the road itself. Whatever happens out there doesn't rely on luck or opportunity. It relies on travelers trusting a screen to guide them somewhere unfamiliar. I still take road trips, but I plan them like a paranoid person now. Offline maps, printed routes, and a hard rule to never follow a detour once service drops. Some places don't want visitors, and they make that clear in ways that never show up on a map.